Hello everyone. This is a continuation of a series of commentaries I am doing on Bungie's Halo campaigns. Halo 2 released on November 9th, 2004, nearly 3 years to the day of the Halo Combat Evolved and original Xbox release. Throughout this commentary, I am going to be referencing the first commentary, so if you haven't checked that one out, I would highly recommend going back and listening to that first commentary. A bit of housekeeping before we begin. I ended the previous commentary with the argument that Halo Combat Evolved is likely the best campaign, and the subsequent Halo games would come about after having learned the wrong lessons. This is an open question and a subjective one. Each of the Halo games did great things to change the formula of what Halo would become by the time Halo Reach released, and as such, many players may have welcomed the changes to movement, combat, and graphics. I assumed that it would be better for me to let you know up front what my biases were. As such, when I discuss the benefits and weaknesses of the series, and where I riff about weapons, you will hear me speak from this perspective. I will be playing the Halo 2 campaign on heroic difficulty with the fog skull on. I had hoped that disabling the motion tracker would remove it from the heads-up display, giving me back some valuable image space. That would not come to pass. Instead, the motion tracker sits there awkwardly with a giant X crossing out the feature. One of my pet peeves about many games is the inability to disable HUD features for more immersion, so that is one critique I suppose I could make right off the bat about the Master Chief Collection. To be honest, the motion tracker in Halo 2 is not as necessary as one might think. I hope to explain that as we go along. I will be playing the campaign with the original graphics settings, as well as the classical musical score. I will not be playing with scoring turned on, as this feature was not explicitly implemented until Halo 3. Before getting into the campaign proper, I should probably offer a bird's-eye view of Halo 2 in the context of the series. Halo 2 is usually remembered for a couple of key features. First and foremost, it almost single-handedly brought the Xbox into online multiplayer by providing sessions over Xbox Live. The local area network sessions that occurred in close proximity would eventually be a thing of the past, as broadband internet slowly spread in the United States and allowed people to both chat and play Halo 2 multiplayer across wide spaces. Were it not for the massive success of Halo 2's multiplayer, who knows where Xbox would be in relation to Sony and the PlayStation. This commentary, though it is largely focused on the mechanics and effectiveness and choices of the campaign, I feel as though it would be a disservice to the game to not mention its massive appeal in bringing the Xbox to the online stage. The other aspect of Halo 2 that people tend to mention is its ending, which was ridiculed for suggesting that the Chief was going to finish a fight, but only in the third and final installment of a trilogy. My opinion on this matter in hindsight is that I am not so much concerned with the ending of the campaign for Halo 2 as much as I am for the effectiveness of the campaign itself. In my mind, Halo 2 has the worst campaign of the series, for several reasons that seem to come up again and again. It gives me no pleasure to say that Halo 2 is the Dark Souls 2 of the series. Like Dark Souls 2, Halo 2 reached higher and fell flatter. Any fan of the series knows that Bungie had a troubled development when it came to this game, and it shows in the level design, as well as other features that I hope to analyze as we make our way through. Our story picks up right where we left off. The Covenant have convened a trial where they have found a Golden Elite, perhaps a leader of the Covenant forces at Halo, guilty for being unable to stop the Master Chief from destroying Halo and preventing its firing. We see several shaman-like Covenant address the Great Journey and have condemned the Elite in some way. The Master Chief and, by some miracle, Sergeant Johnson, have both returned home to be awarded for the destruction of the Halo ring. We are introduced to several characters who will be with us to the end of Halo 3. Miranda Keyes is Captain Keyes' daughter, who accepts his posthumous medal on his behalf. We are introduced to Lord Hood, Fleet Admiral of the UNSC Navy. We have also come back to our home of Earth, which the Master Chief can see as he is being recalibrated on the Cairo station. The Cairo is one of 3 MAC gun stations, which the extended lore of Halo mentions as orbital defense platforms. Why the Navy decided to hold an awards ceremony on the Cairo is something I will never understand. But it happens to be the first mission with combat. Although there are 15 missions in Halo 2, the first mission is a cutscene called The Heretic, and the second is titled The Armory, where a player is tutorialized on shields and offered the chance to invert their controls like the monsters they are. I will be playing on mouse and keyboard, so I will obviously not be inverting my controls.
You told me there wouldn't be any cameras.
And you told me you were gonna wear something nice. Folks need heroes, Chief. Give them hope. So smile, would ya? Well, we still got something to smile about.
Drawn quite a crowd. If they came to hear me beg, they will be disappointed. Are you sure?
Gentlemen, we're lucky to have you back. Go ahead, Cortana.
Another whisper, sir, near Io. We have probes en route.
I apologize, but we're going to have to make this quick.
You look nice.
Thank you.
Sergeant Major, the Colonial Cross is awarded for acts of singular daring and devotion. For a soldier of the United Earth Space Corps.
There can be no greater heresy. Let him be an example for all who would break our covenant.
Commander Miranda Keyes, your father's actions were in keeping with the highest traditions of military service. His bravery in the face of impossible odds reflects great credit upon himself and the UNSC. The Navy has lost one of its best.
Slip space ruptures directly off our battle cluster.
Show me.
15 Covenant capital ships holding position just outside the kill zone.
This is Fleet Admiral Harper. We are engaging the enemy.
Negative, Admiral. Form a defensive perimeter around the cluster. Commander, get to your ship. Link up with the fleet.
Yes, sir.
You have the Mac gun, Cortana. As soon as they come in range, open up.
Gladly.
Something's not right. The fleet that destroyed Reach was 50 times this size.
Sir, additional contacts. Boarding craft and lots of them.
They're going to try to take our Mac guns offline. Give their capital ships a straight shot at Earth. Master Chief, defend this station.
Yes, sir. I need a weapon.
Right this way.
After instances of Bungie's typical quippy and reverent dialogue, Cortana reports that Covenant have been spotted, and everyone runs to their stations to start the fight. In Halo 2, the movement of the Chief feels tweaked. There is less of a floaty feel to the running, and perhaps the Chief can run slightly faster. He has received a massive boost to his jump capabilities, jumping now much higher than in the first game. The player also has the ability to dual-wield smaller weapons in each hand. You will see me use this tactic sparingly, as I hope to explain in later sections. For now, the opportunity is obvious, given how close range this first encounter is, and how there are no grenades to work with as of yet. Like the first Halo, the Chief can carry 4 of each type of grenade. The design decision to sacrifice grenades for greater shooting power is a great halfway point between the triumvirate of Halo, weapons, grenades, and melee. Given this exchange, as well as changes to shields, recharge time, and level design, and Halo 2 feels faster and more lethal than Halo 1. The Chief has no health bars, unlike last game, but the player has some reserve of health that is not mentioned in the HUD. I do not understand why this reserve is not explicitly shown. and it is one more aspect of Halo 2 that makes the game more difficult. Knowing when to risk aggressive combat and when to hold back becomes a much more ambiguous decision, and it led me to many, many more deaths in Halo 2. It is often reported that Halo 2 is the most difficult campaign, and I am in agreement. Many, though not all, of the reasons for this have already been present in Cairo Station. The previously mentioned design changes make the sequel a faster and more violent game, but also the range of encounters has been shrunk. As the player makes their way through Cairo Station, the player will notice that, compared to the Autumn, some sections are smaller than the long lanes of firing we saw on the Pillar of Autumn. However, there are some other sections which are larger, so this might be a good time to mention the battle rifle. Used throughout the series, the battle rifle is the supplanted weapon to the Magnum pistol, in that it fires 12 3-round bursts for a magazine of 36 rounds. The battle rifle also features a 2x optical zoom. At medium range, the battle rifle is an ideal candidate for precision firing, as its accuracy and 3-round burst firing mode allows for several redundancies in case the player happens to be close, but not quite on the head for a headshot. Compared to the pistol, the battle rifle operates for the most part in closer ranges in the second game, though not always, so the player gets the sense that the battle rifle is more of a hit-scan weapon. In any case, the battle rifle is a good all-around weapon for most scenarios. Its design mimics slightly the French-made FAMAS with its bullpup design and handle, and has a firing sound in between the assault rifle and the Magnum pistol in terms of pitch. Astute players knew in Halo 2 that, because of aim assist, it was most efficient to aim just slightly above an enemy's head, and the battle rifle's shots would land most effectively on only the head itself. The assault rifle has been dropped entirely in favor of the SMG. The SMG has 60 rounds, like the assault rifle, but fires a smaller caliber in an equally inaccurate spread. When dual-wielding with two SMGs, the weapons can tear through shields and flesh, though the SMG is best paired with a plasma weapon for faster kills or a pistol for a precision headshot. I rarely used the SMG in this playthrough, and I remember as a teenager being quite disappointed with the SMG as a starting weapon for many multiplayer matches. Compared to the power and heft of the assault rifle, the SMG's anemic sound when mag dumping felt a little short between the legs. The SMG cannot stand on its own in any scenario, and either ends with other weapons in the second hand, grenades, or a melee attack. So despite my distaste, I have to concede that the SMG rests smartly in a weak position that makes the other components of Halo combat necessary. One other change that came about with Halo 2 is in the mechanics to co-op. In Halo 1, if a player died, the other player needed only to get out of harm's way in order for that dead player to respawn. In Halo 2, if one of the two players died, the game would revert back to the previous checkpoint. This made the prospect of playing on Legendary profoundly more difficult. In future installments, the game would relegate this feature to a skull called Iron, where, if activated on solo play, the entire level would be start over. I am glad that the games chose to do this, as Halo is a great game to introduce people to console shooters. Like I said before, Bungie is often very smart with their color grading, and the human versus alien differences in look and feel can make target acquisition that much easier for a person who is looking to get into shooting games for the first time. Using co-op to grandfather someone into the experience is much easier when a player can die without feeling too bad, as they will just come back. Those veteran players looking for an added challenge can use a skull to bring that mechanic back. Compared to other missions in Halo 2, I actually quite like Cairo Station. It has several twists and turns and multiple heights, making it a versatile map, and fun to replay in co-op. At one point, the Chief gets to venture out into space, and navigate the Mac gun as it is firing, which is a nice change of pace to the more static maps of the first Halo. It features short and long ranges, and even if the game suffers from not knowing how to use some of these ranges, it still benefits from this variety. Unfortunately, much of the Halo 2 campaign will not have this variety, and I'll explain why as we go along. The plasma pistols and rifle have received minor tweaks to their sounds and behaviors. The plasma pistol shot has a little kickback added to its recoil that makes it less effective for spamming, like I did with Halo 1. Its charged shot, however, moves much faster and tracks much better, which may help to alleviate some of the complications that arise with a faster, more violent, and lethal Halo campaign than Halo 1. The plasma rifle received minimal work other than its ability now to be dual-wielded, which helps to place it a little better into a category. In my mind, a plasma SMG should have been created to contrast the human SMG, while the plasma rifle should have received an upgrade. This would happen in later games. For now, the plasma rifle is a weapon, once again, that I barely use. One of the core features of Halo 2 that introduces itself in Cairo Station is in the use of transit tools. If you remember from my first commentary, I spoke about making improvements to the level design of the library mission. One of those suggestions was in using some form of elevator or gondola to move players throughout the level. Well, here we get a lengthy elevator scene where the player encounters drones for the first time. Drones are fast-moving flying types that buzz around the player annoyingly and truly test the targeting abilities of even a veteran player. A beginner player will more likely hide and wait for a drone to land, as the drones can only fly aggressively for a short time before having to land. The drone will take a back seat in later games, but here in Halo 2 they will be used extensively. They presented, I think, a much easier AI method of programming for Bungie, as there is plenty of space above the ground to have them fly. I think it is nice to use the player's full range of vision to give them something to shoot at, above or below them, but I also believe that the drone enemy is a crutch for a far more simplistic level design. I called Halo 2 the Dark Souls 2 of Bungie's series, and it is true even down to the way levels are designed. In many respects, the immense verticality of levels and the winding and almost beautiful layouts of the first Halo have been replaced with an incredibly thin and narrow and straight set of encounters. Just like Dark Souls 2, Halo 2 seemed to give up complexity in favor of what they hoped to be technical achievement. The gondolas and elevators, too, are a technical maneuver that allowed Bungie to load in the next parts of levels, as they were certain the player would be stuck on the apparatus until the next set piece. Once you have played enough games, a gamer can start to gain a certain degree of understanding of how games work, either through word of mouth, through critiques, or perhaps they educate themselves on the role of technology in providing the stimulating power of video games. Because of that, a player learns that there is very much a form follows function design philosophy. One of the reasons that Kratos ends up squeezing through rock outcroppings often, in God of War Ragnarok for example, is because it lets the game know where the player is likely to be, allowing them to get rid of previous moments in favor of newer ones. It's clear that Bungie, from the first game to the second, really wanted to push the envelope of their graphics and physics engine. The lighting and shadows are far more pronounced, and textures were so much more complex than those original Xbox players had to see a bunch of ugly texture pop in, though these would go away once a gamer had acquired the more powerful Xbox 360 in 2005. So it stands to reason that, because of this push, Bungie simply had to make the player stand around for certain moments. This elevator ride, though it brings enemies to the chief, must be ridden back down, and during that time, there is no combat. There is simply waiting. In my mind, what killed Halo 2 has to do with a lot of things, but one of those is pace. Because of these gondola experiences, replaying the campaign is a pain in the ass. Veteran players in the first Halo game know what to do, and for the majority of the time there is nothing impeding them from doing it. Halo 2 makes several choices to stop a player in his or her tracks, and it kills the pacing and thus the overall experience of that formula. This moment outside is one of my least favorite. While I mentioned earlier loving the idea of space in this first mission, I despise the combat in it. You're going to hear that a lot as we go along. Just think about what this is. It's a massive straight line, and at the far end is a Covenant elite shooting a turret. In the first Halo, stationary turrets took the form of shade turrets, which fired slow projectiles that, yes, kept the player on his or her feet, but were unthreatening. Shade turrets changed form in Halo 2, but stationary turrets were replaced entirely with a smaller plasma variant that rapid-fire plasma shots accurately. While the Chief may have a battle rifle to whittle away at shields, there is no Covenant equivalent at range at this point in the campaign, so the player is left to handle this in a single way. They must shoot with whatever weapon is on hand, and take cover when their shields go down. It is very simple, but also frustrating. When the player does decide to venture out, several elites with jetpacks attack the player from above. They move too fast for many Covenant weapons, so the end result is to either get lucky by charging a plasma pistol, or by whittling from a distance. Because the elites are high above you, there is effectively no cover to break line of sight, and as the Mac gun moves down and up, the strangeness of the distance between player and the elite can fluctuate rapidly. Not only that, but the AI guiding the elites with jetpacks will often float awkwardly in strange places and not know what to do. So the outdoor sections prove themselves to be a cool idea, but are marred by too many problems. On higher difficulties, with twin plasma rifles and the ability to lead the chief, a player may go down in the blink of an eye. This kind of fighting will occur in one more space section, before the final room with a bomb. If you ever get the chance to listen to the developer commentary of Cairo Station, one of their complaints is how a Covenant ship flies right past the Mac gun and is a moment the player is expected to see, only most players do not see it. This discussion is very interesting for a number of reasons. First of all, Bungie created a scenario where the player is looking either straight ahead or slightly to the left. The Covenant ship crosses the line of sight along the right side, but is so heavily covered by the Cairo Station that it is not easy to see. Another problem is the fact that the player on higher difficulties is, as we've said, still hiding in the doorway. Listening to the Bungie commentary is something I find difficult to do, as each person in the room seems to be cynically jibing at one another about what each one lacks. I think Halo 2 can be sort of distilled into this one moment. One developer wants more spectacle, story, and adventure, while others perhaps wanted more impressive gameplay scenarios, but narrative won out. Many of the missions feel like padding for the cinematics and story, and that switch from the first game is what makes Halo 2 so much harder to play on repeat sessions. In Halo 1, it is the player who is doing the cool stuff in the campaign. In Halo 2, the player effectively stitches together cool moments that the characters get to do. Compared to Pillar of Autumn, I prefer Cairo Station's overall geometry, but we should not forget to mention how similar they are as narrative set pieces. A spaceship of subtype is being boarded by enemy craft. In this particular scenario, they brought a bomb, which comes up again as a set piece in Halo 3. One wonders why they had to start the game in this way. They could have started on Earth, where a chief receives an award, and then is whisked away to the fight once he receives word that the Covenant are on Earth. Mechanically, there might not be much of a difference, but narratively and aesthetically there would be. Speaking of aesthetics, I must confess that I find the overall look of Halo 2 to be incredibly ugly. What was lost from the simplicity of Halo Combat Evolved is gained here with more detail and texture complexity, but its interaction with lighting makes it less compelling. In the original Halo, what made Bungie's simple textures work was its color palette. Here, like in the Maw, the last mission of the first game, we get more subdued colors. Purples gain a brownish mixture, and greens are more sage and less vibrant. Plasma weapons, fortunately, are still bright, thanks to this glowing lighting change, and there is a big reward sometimes in contrast, but in my mind, Bungie was unable to leverage the original Xbox for what they wanted. In doing some very brief searching, it appears that the Vista version, which is the one we have here, did marginally better in producing a cleaner look. Perhaps the game was never meant to have this high of a resolution, and so muddier and soft standard definition was able to smooth over a lot of these ugly tendencies in the look. In motion, the combat looks great, though there are some differences in lighting with, for example, the Spectre turret and a charged plasma pistol shot that you will notice, but the combat is placed into a canvas that I really think did not age well over the years, and looks sort of flat. Again, this drab flatness reminds me of the failed attempt of Dark Souls 2 to graphically showcase light and dark. By the end of the first mission, Cortana finds herself back in the Chief's head. We can continue to hear Cortana in our head for the majority of the runtime in Halo 2, in much the same way as Halo 1, and this time, Cortana gets much more screen time. The animation and look of Cortana has received an uplift as a result, so it's nice to see Cortana taking on a more substantial role visually as well as in voiceover. Unlike Halo 1, the Chief is never alone with her, though she will obviously not be present with the Arbiter. The ending of Cairo Station has the Chief send the bomb back to the Covenant in a high-spectacle scene. We can expect far more cutscenes in Halo 2 to connect the dots between the 15 missions. Many of these scenes are more involved than the introduction and ending of each mission in Halo 1, which was largely getting on and off a Pelican dropship. We should also mention that several levels were cut from the final product of Halo 2. One such mission, occurring in between Cairo Station and outskirts, that would have the Chief and possibly Miranda Keyes, guarded by some orbital drop shock troopers, navigate a Covenant ship. For now, we can see our cast of characters going towards Earth for our next mission.
It's your call, Sarge.
We're going in. Get tactical, Marines!
Master Chief, get aboard that carrier. Secure the Prophet of Regret. This is the only place on Earth the Covenant decided to land. That Prophet is going to tell us why. 30 seconds out.
Stand by to...
Whoa.
Halo 2 introduced skulls into the campaign. If the player picks up these skulls, the effect it had would maintain itself until a player turned off their Xbox. So if a player wanted to have multiple skulls activated, they would have to go into several missions and physically acquire these skulls to turn certain effects on. Sputnik, my favorite skull, was luckily a little easier to acquire, and at the beginning of each session of Halo 2, I would, as a teenager, go and pick it up. The most difficult skull that I was never able to acquire was the I would have been your daddy skull, because this skull physically places you in a situation that you have to fight your way out of. Halo 2's skulls carried, as a result, a certain mystery that the later games would make a little more explicit and less tedious. Here in Outskirts, I am showing you the blind skull, which removes your HUD as well as the image of your weapon. The goal of the Master Chief and the rest of the crew is to chase down the Prophet of Regret, who appeared near Earth without knowing that there would be humans inhabiting it. They are slowed down by the appearance of the Scarab. Fans who followed Bungie's development know that Bungie did not like the Scarab tank as a feature of these early missions, but in my mind it does okay. It helps to establish a sort of combat arc through these missions, and provides a leitmotif throughout the series. By Halo 2 and 3, the player needed a type of enemy that functions just as much in size as logic. The Scarab requires multiple steps to destroy, a step above in combat problem solving compared to what we've seen thus far. What Bungie probably did not like about the Scarab in Halo 2 is the context in which it is placed. It is more of a fight with predetermined choices. Later in the series, the Scarab was placed in a much more open environment, giving the player the opportunity to take multiple approaches. Overall, Outskirts is an above-average Halo mission, placed in the second highest category of S by the community over at tiermaker.com. But the beginning of Outskirts is, in my opinion, a misstep. There's plenty of geography here in this urban portion that feels unused. The Covenant are in the courtyard and larger structure, and they will pour out of the streets and alleys nearby. Similar to the second mission of the first game, the player survives a crash landing, is tasked with holding their ground with Marines, and they will later use a Warthog. But here, the pacing of the first level comes to a complete halt. When considering the goals previously mentioned, it seems strange that the Chief, Johnson, and the Marines would sit tight, especially because later the Pelican pilot says that they cannot fit and have to land elsewhere. The extraction point for Johnson is only a couple of blocks down, and the Chief proceeds on foot. Yet here we are, fighting in one place. We can all complain about the repeated geometry of the first game, but this first mission features the Chief holding the position in a static environment for a long time. And I mean, a very long time. There are several waves of Covenant, from both the alleys and from where we just came from. There are drones that arrive, as well as Jackal snipers, and eventually we will have hunters. I think Outskirts is no match for the second mission of Halo. I am aware that, unlike Halo, there is nothing to be explored here on Earth, and perhaps more is given over to combat. But the differences in the spaces allotted to combat felt so much more grand. The 3 separate areas that you defend for the second mission are spacious and add their own variety. In Halo 1, we spent plenty of time getting the Chief's steps in, giving us agency for getting from place to place. In this level, and Halo 2 in general, we hurry up and wait. Since we have so much time, we should probably give the Covenant a once-over and compare them to before. One of the first things to mention is the implementation of ragdoll physics for deaths. I, of course, think ragdoll physics should be in every shooter, and I think enemies should respond with feedback throughout getting shot, even unto death. Killing in Halo 2 is, for the most part, satisfying, especially with explosive deaths where bodies are launched. I'm a simple man. That being said, if Bungie had to sacrifice level design to make ragdoll physics happen, I would take Halo 1's trade back. But of course, I do not know how much of a tax each mechanic makes on the overall load of the Halo 2 campaign. The Grunt makes a return, and moves faster, has more options, including carrying and deploying plasma stationary guns, and is far more animated and verbose than even the first game. The Grunt has far more detail in their armor, including some lighting done to the seams of it in several spots. Their colors are similar to before, with red and yellow primary colors as easy ones to spot. Other more advanced Grunts wear white. Grunts are more fodder than threat in Halo 2, but can still be a headache by throwing grenades, and plasma grenades, we should mention, have a much shorter fuse time than Halo 1. The Jackal shield will break with a lot more fanfare this time around, but the Jackal also moves around much faster than Halo 1. As you can see, the concept of faster makes its way into a lot of our sentences when discussing changes. Jackals are also more adept in other types of activities, not just using a shield. More infamously, Jackals can now use beam rifles, and Jackal snipers litter the campaign. There are occasions where 3 Jackals can even appear side by side with beam rifles. On heroic difficulty, the sniper will remove the player's shields. On legendary, it is an instant kill. I think that, for the most part, Jackal snipers were a miserable idea. I'll talk about this at length when we get to Jackal Alley. With that, I'll move on to elites. Elites are still as lethal as they used to be, with acrobatics that allow them to also climb objects to get the jump on the Chief. But they can also dual-wield weapons, achieving parity with the Chief once again. Elites have always been a fun inclusion to the Halo enemy variety, made more so by their capacity as leadership. Their life and death still affects underlings nearby. And Hunters, when we see them soon, are not quite as fleshy and vulnerable as their hilariously weak counterparts in Halo 1, but, on heroic, they still only need one well-placed shot to the back by a sniper rifle. Their fuel rod cannon has replaced its projectile with a more beam-like force. This to me seems like it gives the Hunter something special for them to distinguish them from the shoulder-fed fuel rod cannons that the player can now use, but it also may be an attempt to broadcast their attacks a little more noticeably. In the first Halo, a player had precious little time to react. Here the beam moves slowly, but it is very strong, and can even exert force to move objects. Hunters now have an ability to react to players behind them with a melee attack that will likely surprise first-time players. Hunters also seem faster when moving, so overall a faster speed, more movement and animation, and a wider arsenal to equip, which I'll talk about as we encounter them. By the end of Outskirts, every single human weapon will have been reintroduced. We have not talked about the toned-down Magnum pistol. This stripped-down C variant, according to the game manual, does not have a zoom-in, and does not have the damage or the magazine size that the original did. This is likely to make space for the battle rifle. Now, instead, the Magnum sits comfortably alongside several other small one-handed weapons. There is little reason to choose carefully when firing these, as the range will likely be close. It does still count as a precision weapon, but imagining a player using this as solely such with the ubiquity of the battle rifle in these encounters makes me laugh. The next set piece after the courtyard is a linear alleyway with debris scattered throughout, giving the Pelican space to land. If the player is able to jump onto the higher ledge, they can pick up a sniper rifle. The sniper rifle maintains its anti-material 14.5mm rounds that can pierce targets, but loses its night vision capability. While the sniper rifle maintained dominance in the first game as the only long-range weapon, here it is mitigated by others. This set piece's linear hallway design in its shooting will begin to seem very familiar. Once again, Jackal snipers exist in the shadows to pick off the Master Chief. One of the things that you will notice in these levels is that with each place there is also an attempt to slow the player down in that location. Rather than each location feeling like an attempt to create a novel encounter or to create a cinematic scene, enemies are packed into narrow corridors, and reinforcements typically arrive right when a player is trying to leave a zone. Here the Jackal snipers slow the player down immensely. A death means going back to the checkpoint, even with a partner. On heroic, the loss of shields means that the Chief is basically vulnerable to a quick death, so the player has no choice but to hide and wait. If a player is ballsy, they can choose to confront the problem in a risky maneuver, but if we're being honest with ourselves, there's usually no downside in waiting, except to grate on the player's nerves. The next section of streets is very similar to before. We have a narrow alley with snipers at the end, only this time Marines and the Chief can be flanked on the left by adjacent alleys. The geometry of this place is interesting, but most of it is unused, save for the long angles. The amount of snipers here borders on absurdity. and the player will be forced to slowly pie each angle until they are confident that they have killed each one before moving on, so they are not shot in the back. For now, many of the Jackal snipers appear out of reach, likely due to the ability to access the beam rifle so soon in the game. But this won't be the case forever, and the beam rifle is so ubiquitous because of Bungie's insecurity perhaps towards their combat encounters. I happen to love the beam rifle, but for all the wrong reasons. Even back in 2004, using the beam rifle on a controller was relatively easy to land headshots. You must remember that players had been given 3 years to play Halo, and in that time had developed skills with an analog stick. Not only that, but the Magnum pistol was an excellent training tool in aiming for the head. So now we are equipped with a precision sniper rifle that, as long as one could time their shots slowly, never had to be reloaded. And you can find this weapon in many levels. Obviously, you're going to see me use this like I used the plasma pistol from Halo 1. In a way, it wasn't likely meant to be used. I will use it even in close quarters, and sometimes at point-blank range against hunters. To me, the beam rifle not only represents a huge step down in combat encounters, but it also changes the perhaps intended way that Halo was meant to be played. In the previous game, I had talked about the leverage the player has because the Covenant arsenal featured much slower projectiles. It empowered the player. With the addition of the carbine and the beam rifle, 2 ranged precision weapons with a near instant travel speed, the combat changed immensely. It is foolish for any player to ignore the Jackal sniper for very long. That means that they must be the first to die. This dictates quite a bit of opening engagements. Compare this to the balance of the first game. For example, taking out elites causes the grunts to panic, but taking out grunts first is easy. It makes killing an elite later even easier. Both of these options are viable, but leaving a Jackal sniper for last is not viable, and using them so often means that beam rifles are around often. So most of the game ends up being played in the spaces between when a player does not have access to these weapons and outside of these scenarios. That is a very complex phrase, but I will try to explicate it as we move on. In the alleyways, we are faced with even more waves of enemies, arriving over and over again. Notice that we have another occurrence of the game sending enemies from the place we need to go, so as to slow the player down. The section after this feels a little more like what we remember from Halo. We have Marines and Covenant already fighting in a building, and we are given some lanes, and therefore more choices, and there are less impediments to using the geometry to our advantage. The connecting hallway to our first vehicle encounter is, of course, another hallway. We are provided with a flashlight. One of the differences between Halo 1 and 2 is that Halo 2 does not require a battery to recharge. In Halo 1, losing a flashlight due to a battery being out was actually quite possible in a level like the library. In Halo 2, opportunities for the flashlight are rare. We have seen the new dropship, the Phantom, before, but here is a good place to talk about it. The Phantom receives not 1, but 3 turrets. However, these can be shot off with explosives or enough bullet damage. The Phantom's turrets are faster than a shade turret, and they produce a great scorching effect on the ground where the plasma lands. There is a little splash damage, but the sheer volley of projectiles is what keeps a player from poking their head out. The Phantom is here to stay, and would be iterated on for the rest of the series with mixed results. One might also notice that the Phantom keeps Covenant in the ship until the last possible moment, where they are ejected out of the bottom. I spoke last time about how not only was it easy to dodge the dropship shade turret shots, but one could also plug away at Covenant while they rested awkwardly with the doors open. While it is not as flashy, I would say that this Phantom is a better method. Players can still pick off Covenant while in midair, but it is a more balanced scenario. All vehicles now have health, though we do not see this in a bar. Instead, unlike the Chief, we can see periodic damage models appear on the Warthog. This is obviously great, and helps to factor in whether a player should hold on to a vehicle or abandon it. The Warthog has much better traction this time around, and with a center of gravity that feels lower. If a player chooses, they can use a handbrake function to drift. While I prefer the first Warthog, I know that this version is objectively better. The chain turret is far more accurate, and Marines will not only shoot better with the turret, but they can also drive vehicles. Unfortunately, AI driving is usually going to lead to accidents or disaster, even if the player is in the vehicle, so I will usually do the driving. We are also introduced to the new Ghost, which features a boost that makes it incredibly fast, while also sticking to the ground much more. If destroyed, the Ghost has a secondary explosion, where the Ghost flails around randomly and detonates, possibly causing damage or death, but always causing fun. At heroic difficulty in Halo 2, many of the features of the game are strained. It is always advisable, for example, to drive vehicles, because the AI has no problem throwing itself at the enemy and causing a quick death. A player must maintain distance and strafe around to avoid projectiles. A player is incentivized to get out of the vehicle and pick off snipers before getting back into the vehicle to keep the Marines or other allies alive. The Covenant leads a player very well with plasma projectiles that feel much faster, especially the charged plasma pistol, so the player is, combined with sniper fire, to use cover far more, and to stay put and pick off enemies with precision ammo. Rather than have the Chief explore with the Warthog is used much more often in conflict resolution and encounters. I actually quite like the final open encounter of the Warthog before going into the tunnels, as it reminds me of the Lightbridge encounter in the second mission from Halo 1. We have an open space out front, where the player can drive freely, but we have debris and cover where the Covenant are hunkered down, so it is difficult to get in. Along the way, a Phantom is attempting to batter the player down, if the player does not disarm the turrets. I think for a vehicle scenario, it does very well. The shore is quite ugly, with browns and grays, and does not have the vibrance and color arrangement of the Silent Cartographer, but it still does a decent job of giving the player a different experience in Halo 2 compared to what came before. We have slowly worked our way out of the city and can breathe a little more into the geometry of the level design, but don't get too comfortable, because we'll be heading into the tunnels soon enough. The rocket launcher has gotten a major boost to its capabilities in the form of heat seeking. Compared to the launcher from Halo 1, the rocket moves much faster, a trend we've mentioned over and over again. The heat seeking is not perfect, and if in multiplayer the rocket fires, a player can sometimes avoid the rocket with some skilled driving. The AI will also attempt this, and sometimes successfully. I think for Banshees, rocket launchers having heat seeking may have been a necessary evil, but for a player to simply need to point and shoot makes vehicles even more vulnerable and empowers beginning players. I'm not exactly sure what to make of these tunnels. Once again, it's a linear progression from A to B, but I do like how these shadow vehicles create a convoy that a player can drive alongside and shoot against. In co-op with a Warthog, this is a novel experience for the series, so I can give it a pass. Here instead, I use a Ghost, as I have a little more control for survivability. Here also, the two strategies of Halo make themselves known, either holding back, being patient, and picking away methodically, or rushing through. In the final scene, a player can rush through the entire final set piece without firing a shot, and can do so rather easily. I've not really spent time evaluating these two strategies. Is it okay for an action game to allow such an easy method for clearing through it? I suppose whoever knows how to do these speedruns, rushing through the levels, has clearly played the level before, and we can infer that they played fairly. So I suppose if a player wants to rush through and avoid what Bungie has worked hard to provide, that is their choice. You'll see me do this several times throughout the campaign, especially with the Arbiter levels, for obvious reasons. I hope to explain the choices I make with rushing through a section as I go along. We have to concede that certain choices that Bungie made had unplanned side effects. The Ghost moves so fast when boosting, and there is no cooldown, so that a Ghost can effectively race past enemy projectiles and level geography. I admit, I raced past more moments in Halo 2 than I did in Halo 1, and if I had to speculate as to why, it goes back to that idea of pacing. Much of Halo 1 felt like the game was willing to let the Master Chief move pretty continuously at max pace. Even if a player is attempting to rush past, what is interesting is that the max speed and the slowest speed of Halo 1 are not as wide. As a result, the Covenant are much better at adapting to a player attempting to rush. Flood are fast, vehicles are slower and more floaty, and the Master Chief cannot board an enemy vehicle. To me, there is just a big incentive difference for Halo 1 than Halo 2, and it is not only the explicit choices of level design, but also some implicit ones. The simplicity of the gameplay was to its benefit. I don't think this is Bungie's fault, necessarily. There are a lot of new features in Halo 2, but that does not mean that it is not a problem.
It blew right through us. 50 cal rockets didn't do a thing.
the rest of your platoon?
Wasted, Sarge.
And we will be too, sir, if we don't get the hell out of here.
You hit Marine?
No, sir.
Then listen up. When I joined the Corps, we didn't have any fancy schmancy tanks. We had sticks, 2 sticks and a rock for a whole platoon. And we had to share the rock. Buck up, boy. You're one very lucky Marine.
What about that Scarab?
We've all run the simulations. They're tough, but they ain't invincible. Stay with the Master Chief. He'll know what to do.
Yes, sir, Sergeant.
Thanks for the tank. B never gets me anything.
Oh, I know what the ladies like.
If I had to speculate, I think one of the goals of Halo 2 was to maximize geometry. Keep in mind that in this time, multiplayer maps and single-player campaigns were largely separate and distinct. The amount of content that was expected on day one was high, because there was no other option. Compared to our first tank set piece from Assault on the Control Room, the bridge of this second set piece is incredibly narrow, but very long. There's a far greater resistance in terms of vehicles and infantry compared to the first set piece, but the Scorpion has seen some improvements in speed and in accuracy, not to mention the fire rate of the Scorpion's cannon has been increased as well. So, with mouse and keyboard, you're going to see, even on Heroic, one of the easiest moments of Halo 2's campaign. The enemy just cannot seem to throw enough stuff at the player to give them trouble. The distance is so far, and the options for the Covenant just as narrow, that the game even attempts to throw some aerial vehicles into the mix. But the accuracy of the Scorpion tanks means that the player is at a distinct advantage, especially if he or she knows what to expect. I was pretty wowed by the first playthrough with the Metropolis level, as it starts with a bridge, continues into the tunnels, comes out of the tunnels, continues with a Gauss Warthog, and then there is the fated Scarab fight. All told, a great combination of set pieces, many of which are novel and original for the series thus far. Metropolis sits low on the S tier of missions from the community, and when I think about Halo 2's campaign as a whole, Metropolis might just be the best mission in it. I have my disappointments with this tank section. Just think about what we saw in our first Scorpion set piece. The Chief was given a tank, but also a choice of multiple directions after the original reveal. Then, the player had to navigate going down into a tunnel, much like Metropolis, but in the context of several turrets, 2 Wraith tanks, one that was inaccessible from our lower point, and hunters at the end. The space was wide and open, but if the player thought about the context, there were methods for avoiding fire. The player took the Scorpion tank into the tunnels and back out again, and was offered yet another choice of 2 lanes. As far as missions in Halo 2 go, Metropolis is great, but great is relative when we speak of the whole series. And this tank mission, once you fire that first shot, has said most of what it wants to say. I wonder if, in order for the game to render in the way it does, it elongated many of these missions and created as much distance as possible, so as to be able to give the original Xbox time to load in these set pieces. I think one method of future-proofing games is to prioritize loading, which is something of a taboo statement. When I played The Elder Scrolls Morrowind on the original Xbox, the game would have to stop itself in order to load the map as I was walking. This would occur most obviously when a character's speed was much faster. Many characters seem slow, perhaps for that reason. But now, on modern technology, this is not a problem. So although Morrowind took a long time to load between exteriors and interiors, the game aged well. Compared to Halo 1, I do not think that Halo 2 has aged well, because instead of playing the game and enjoying it, I'm speculating on what is going on backstage that made the campaign effectively the Dark Souls 2 of the Halo series. Straight lines everywhere, lengthy stretches, enemies padding out and trying to slow the player down. As these Wraith tanks come out, one feature you are going to see again and again is the instance of making enemies appear at where the player needs to go, but only right when they've arrived. I've mentioned this before. At first this is a surprising feature, but used as gratuitously as it is in this campaign, and it can wear on you. There's nothing more frustrating than feeling as though you have mastered a section of a level, only for the developers to claim that you need to fight more, in a very precarious position. Often for these moments, the player is caught out of position, in the middle of the set piece. We spoke in Halo 1 about spawning enemies out of monster closets. Well, the exit to certain scenes effectively becomes a monster closet. What is fascinating about Halo 2 is that often the levels are so linear and so narrow that unfortunately the only logical place for enemies to appear is where the player is headed. Compare this to something like Truth and Reconciliation. Granted, there are moments when enemies will appear on the cliffside where the player is headed, but in the Covenant ship, enemies can appear from a variety of places. I don't want to be unfair, This did happen a lot in Halo 1, but these instances were more balanced with other set pieces. One of the fun aspects of Halo is in its almost willingness for you to stretch its mechanics. There are two Marines who arrive in a Warthog in the tunnel, and then they get out, thinking that they won't need the Warthog anymore. But I, however, have other plans. When playing with my family over certain holidays, we got a great kick out of pushing vehicles into sections where it does not seem like it is allowed. Games are much tighter now, and more controlled as far as mechanics are concerned. But Bungie used to be a company that leaned into the power of a player to mess not only with the explicitly designed systems, but exploiting them for player enjoyment. As well as vehicles, one great Easter egg on Metropolis was the Scarab gun. There are various methods to retrieve it, but once found, it looked like a plasma rifle, but fired like the Scarab gun, effectively making it the most powerful weapon ever devised in the series. Bungie did not have to do this, but they did, and even with the harried and problematic development and the compromised final result. I think this is great, and once again, it's a way for a game company to build a culture. In today's market, gaming has been taken over by certain moneyed interests, and public companies want every asset and texture to have money trails that provide profit for weeks, months, or years. So what does a Scarab gun mean to them? Largely nothing. If anything, it circumvents aspects of what a battle pass or what a seasonal model is designed to do. While I may critique Halo 2 rigorously, we still should not forget that, in certain circumstances, we do not even deserve Halo. Coming out of the tunnels, I like this set piece for its ability to at least provide a little more lateral movement for the player. There is a rotunda in the middle, while a Marine in a Gauss Warthog revolves, waiting for the player to drop down. The player first encounters a Jackal sniper patrolling away from the player, so the game is basically begging you to use the beam rifle at this moment. The amount of other snipers in the middle once again irks me. I think in hindsight, the Jackal sniper should not have been a hit-scan weapon. I think the projectile should have moved faster than the plasma pistol and rifle, and perhaps might have been a different color, like a red or orange, something that pulls the player's eye, and that travels fast, but could be just avoided if the player was paying attention. This may have been impossible to implement in 2004, but it was clearly something Bungie was thinking about. The beam rifle in Halo would be augmented by the focus rifle in Halo Reach, which keeps the hit scan method, but turns into a weapon that drains an enemy rather than snipes them. This is, I think, a profoundly better solution, and imagining several focus rifles here ringing out rather than beam rifles would have improved the look and feel of these levels in Halo 2 in a significant way. Against a focus rifle, a player is given options. You could technically brute force your way from one place to another, not to mention that a focus rifle broadcasts the enemy position much more obviously. In this rotunda, it's shocking how little cover there is initially, and the expanse between the entrance and the rotunda is quite large, so the prospect of a player brute forcing this in the face of many Jackal snipers is laughable. So I imagine that most players on Heroic and Legendary wait it out and keep their distance, while easy and normal players have all the fun with the Gauss Warthog. The Gauss Warthog is one of several variants of the Warthog we will encounter throughout the series. The manual claims that the Warthog fires a 25mm projectile at hypersonic velocity, which means that it rests comfortably between the Scorpion tank and the Gatling gun Warthog. The Gauss sound is satisfyingly strange, and the punch that it provides is noticeable. With the Sputnik skull on, the Gauss cannon is an unhinged weapon that can create insane moments. In future games, the Gauss cannon would be sped up to a much faster and almost hit-scan weapon. This is one of the few times we encounter the Gauss Warthog in the series, as the presence of it makes it an undeniably powerful weapon. Its speed from the Warthog and its maneuverability, combined with its firepower, means that the game could not use it extensively. It makes short work of the infantry and vehicles in the following sections. I tend to like these moments because each set piece offers a little variety. Even in the streets, there is a side passage that players can take to get out of harm's way, and they change in elevation to create the pedestrian platforms that Jackal snipers fire from. In solo play, however, both driving and shooting are difficult for the Marines. They do not fire nearly as rapidly with the Gauss Warthog as they need to, so more likely a player may fire and maneuver, getting out of the Warthog driver's seat and into the gunners, back and forth, until all the enemies are dead from a vast distance. The Wraith tank is back in Halo 2, and this time it gets its own plasma turrets to rival the Scorpion coaxial machine gun. The Wraith tank also sports a boost similarly to the Ghost. This was likely to add parity to all Covenant vehicles, but it may also have been designed to counter the new rocket launcher lock-on mechanic, most likely. It was a way for the tank to defend itself against the new boarding mechanic. You will hardly see me use it, perhaps in the final mission, but boarding enemy vehicles was praised widely at E3 and was hailed as a great method for infantry to get a leg up, literally, on vehicles they came against. If a vehicle moves slow enough, and if a player gets close enough, they have the chance to press a button and to board the enemy vehicle, either taking it outright in the case of the Ghost or Banshee, or it gives them the chance to bash the player or throw a grenade into a tank. The rationale for this might be varied. It kept vehicles at a distance, unless they knew they had to commit, so it gave drivers a forced choice. In the light reconnaissance vehicles, it then allowed those players to play more towards their roles. The same holds true for heavy tanks. If a tank goes into an urban area in multiplayer, they must prepare for the worst. Keeping heavy tanks at a distance meant that their effectiveness and accuracy was decreased, but their safety increased. This meant that the threat of boarding was also a soft power that changed behavior in multiplayer encounters. While I missed the overwhelming threat of vehicles in Halo 1, I cannot deny that this was an objectively excellent and rewarding new mechanic for Halo 2. It's difficult to imagine later Halo games without boarding. It is that iconic. All things considered, I still love the Wraith tank. It does for longer ranges what the beam rifle should have done for infantry. The delay in the shot terrifies but also enriches the player and gives them choice. The Scarab set piece on repeated playthroughs is not nearly as effective as the first moment, and perhaps that is where the regret lies by Bungie. I do not have much to say about this moment, but we can talk about how the player is forced to wait to see the Scarab lurch over them. The door to the next set piece remains shut, again preventing the player from moving forward, perhaps hinting at a load time. We can also talk about the catwalks over the Scarab, giving the player multiple opportunities to board before the Scarab rests awkwardly at the end, waiting to die. We should also probably talk about how awkward the physics are on a moving Scarab. The physics in Halo 2 do not follow physics in real life, so when a character fires, it does not take into account how the player is initially in motion. So what results is a bizarre method of accounting for the new physics, or simply getting lucky. Notice how I take the sniper rifle with me as a way to mediate this problem. In later games, killing a Scarab involved shooting its subsystems, but here we simply need to kill all the enemies.
That's right, you mothers! Run!
Not if we can help it, Sergeant.
Extract the chief and return to an amberclad.
Roger that.
Status.
Sir, the Prophet is bugging out. Request permission to engage.
Negative, Commander. I'll vector 2 heavies for Starside intercept.
Bam! Slip space rupture off the target's bow. It's going to jump inside the city.
There's no time, sir.
Green light to engage.
Punch it. Get us close.
Ma'am, without a destination solution.
We are not losing that ship.
How much further must we heft this baggage? Any cell will do? Why not toss it in with this lot? They could use the meat. Hell, what about us? My belly aches, and his flesh is seared just the way I like it. Quiet! To whimper like grunts fresh off the teat. He's not meant for jails. The hierarchs have something special in mind. Noble prophets of truth and mercy. I have brought the incompetent.
You may leave, Tartarus.
But I thought...
And take your brutes with you.
Release the prisoner.
The Council decided to have you hung by your entrails and your corpse paraded through the city. But ultimately, the terms of your execution are up to me.
I am already dead.
Indeed. Do you know where we are?
The mausoleum of the Arbiter.
Quite so. Here rests the vanguard of the great journey. Every Arbiter from first to last. Each one created and consumed in times of extraordinary crisis.
The taming of the Hunters, the Grunt Rebellion. Were it not for the Arbiters, the Covenant would have broken long ago.
Even on my knees, I do not belong in their presence.
Halo's destruction was your error, and you rightly bear the blame. But the Council was overzealous. We know you are no heretic. This is the true face of heresy. One who would subvert our faith and incite rebellion against the High Council.
Our prophets are false. Open your eyes, my brothers. They would use the faith of our forefathers to bring ruin to us all. The great journey is a...
This heretic, and those who follow him, must be silenced.
Their slander offends all who walk the path.
What use am I? I can no longer command ships, lead troops into battle.
Not as you are, no, but become the Arbiter. And you shall be set loose against this heresy with our blessing.
What of the Council?
The tasks you must undertake as the Arbiter are perilous, suicidal. You will die, as each Arbiter has before you. The Council will have their corpse.
What would you have your Arbiter do? When we joined the Covenant, we took an oath. According to our station, all without exception. On the blood of our fathers, on the blood of our sons, we swore to uphold the Covenant. Even to our dying breath. Those who would break this oath are heretics, worthy of neither pity nor mercy. Even now, they use our Lord's creations to broadcast their lies. We shall grind them into dust and continue our march to glorious salvation. This armor suits you, but it cannot hide that mark. Nothing ever will. You are the Arbiter, the will of the prophets. But these are my elites. Their lives matter to me, yours does not. That makes two of us.
There is no doubt the storm will strike the facility. We'll be long gone before it arrives.
The reveal of the ability to play an elite in Halo 2 was received with mixed criticism. It is not the Master Chief. This is also likely the moment where things get weird for players in the story. We hear much more than we thought we would ever get as far as the Covenant culture. Bungie tried to provide parody to the Master Chief with the reveal of the Arbiter's armor in the Mausoleum, but of course as an alien elite, with its grotesque mouth and reptilian figure, it is no comparison to, like, the Na'vi from the Avatar franchise. But on the other hand, I appreciate not being manipulated in such an obvious way. we're introduced to several characters who we'll see further into the series. One is this white elite leader, apparently named Artos Vadum. His wariness for the Arbiter and his loyalty to his own soldiers and his scene is an endearing quality. And the voice actor plays both quiet and loud scenes with a smoldering intensity and command that I think bodes well for the game. As much as I don't like the turn toward cinematics in Halo 2, I must say that they did a pretty impressive job with focus changes, angles, and cinematic moments. In Halo 2 Anniversary, a huge amount of weight was brought to bear on the cinematics, creating an entirely new and high-definition experience that is so good, you sort of wonder what a digitally animated movie or television show would look like in that style. But, if we're being honest, Halo was never decided in cinematics. It was always going to be the gameplay that determined a young person's sense of belonging to the narrative of its universe. The Arbiter's first task is to kill a heretic spouting lies, quote-unquote, about the Halo ring, and the heretic is located in a station suspended over a storm similar to the Great Red Spot on Jupiter. The storm is slowly approaching, giving an arc to the next two missions of increasing volatility. At first, playing as the Arbiter can be quite jarring. You are effectively working alongside Covenant, who you have spent a full game and a third shooting at. Luckily, Bungie did an admirable job of making the Heretic Covenant look distinct. The Arbiter has a leg up on the Chief in the form of a short-duration active camouflage ability that replaces the Chief's flashlight. This active camouflage is a unique feature, and when combined with the ability to use the sword for the first time, is a great introduction. But the invisibility can be abused, and for many Arbiter missions, I do. On the Kane and Ren's podcast, where I did some preliminary work getting back into Halo 2, they mentioned how the Arbiter missions can feel slower paced. Halo 2 is not really a story of the Master Chief, it's a story of the Arbiter, the Covenant, and their growing realization of what the truth is about Halo. Seeing this reveal twice is not as compelling as the first time, and with the alien enemy race, it does not land on those grounds. The usurpation of the elites by the Brutes, as the Prophet's second in command, allows for infighting and civil war among the Covenant, which is much more fun for the player to inhabit. The Covenant story from the Arbiter's perspective means that there is quite a lot of story to be doled out, so there are plenty of moments where the action takes a back seat in favor of cinematics and story. To make a long story short, the Arbiter's missions, though rich in story, are usually lacking in level and encounter design. Abusing the active camouflage, as a result, can prove quite tempting. The Arbiter mission is looked down upon despite the reveal, given a B tier. Why this is perhaps comes down to the repetitious fighting. Even all the new features cannot seem to outweigh this disappointment. We should now talk about the sword, an absolutely necessary weapon against the Flood. The sword brings with it a lunging maneuver that can be triggered once the reticle appears as red for the player. Shotguns versus swords represented as a result an amazing playlist for multiplayer, because a lunging sword carrier could be blasted at the last moment by a shotgun, with the player ragdolling forward due to momentum. The sword is a lower skilled and fun weapon, but there are some nice features. If a player is below their target, the lunge can sometimes be used to get up to higher ground. In dangerous circumstances, a player can accidentally lunge to their death. What the sword provides that the first game lacked is a feeling of commitment to a melee attack. I wanted to wait until the sword to mention this change. If you were watching my Halo 1 commentary, you may have noticed that I missed many of my melee attacks. When I was close, it turned out that I was not close enough. Getting a sense of connection to the melee attack never felt right in Halo 1 because the player model does not lean into the attack like you would expect. Here in Halo 2, the change is immense. It adds to the continuation of a faster and more violent and lethal experience, and the sword is an exaggeration of this mechanic. It's hard not to love the energy sword and what it provides. Though the Heretic Covenant looked different, they, and the entire Arbiter level, look profoundly ugly. The browns and oranges lack the vibrant colors, and the attempted metallic and rusted look does not hold up. The level attempts to make the facility an ad hoc base of operations by making the facility have functional uses. The explosive boxes slide down ramps, and this feature is used throughout the level. There is a loading dock where the player can open the bay doors to let in reinforcements. Viewers might notice that this scene bears some similarity to the layout used in the mission Crow's Nest in Halo 3. The structure of this mission bears some similarity to Truth and Reconciliation. The Arbiter is a stealth mission where the player must, instead of rescuing someone, kill someone instead. The player is introduced to the Sentinel beam in Halo 2. Being able to shoot the Sentinel laser from Halo 1 is nice, but the weapon burns through energy rather quickly. The laser makes quick work of the Flood, but the sword can dispose the body, which makes it the dominant weapon in the future. We'll talk more on this when we get to the next level, the Oracle. The Sentinel laser perhaps could have been used more for gimmicky multiplayer matches, but unfortunately did not have enough personality for that sort of thing. Instead, it is a functional weapon with a simple use case, and not much skill allowance beyond that. The banter back and forth of the Covenant can be quite hilarious. However, one of the problems of modern entertainment is in the erratic tonal shifts from hilarious to dramatic to tragic. I myself prefer a more tonally consistent film or piece of art, so the era of quippy Marvel movie scripts is something I'd like to avoid. Call me pretentious. Even still, I know that many people take delight in the behavior of the Covenant, making them strangely endearing as enemies. Over time, the idea of the enemy would shift to brutes and the Flood, and when it appears that the Covenant and humans form an armistice at the end of Halo 3, one begins to wonder what they were fighting about all along. This is why, in my opinion, one should not look too closely at Halo as a narrative. It is not so much content as it is form. It excels as a method for delivering combat experiences, which is why, when so much effort is placed to provide character, it feels like they miss the point. We can evaluate, if we want, why Bungie felt the need to go into the Covenant. One idea is that they did not know what to do with the Chief. The Master Chief as a Spartan exists at sort of the tail end of his life experience, as all that remains of a vast experiment. They could have done their legwork and provided much needed backstory and flashbacks while continuing the story of Halo, the Flood, and the Covenant. Perhaps they felt like the Chief's story was best told in books, while a grand space epic awaited them in the games. In my mind, the switch to the Arbiter points to an unwillingness to explore the themes of the first game in humanity or in the Chief. They are the same themes of agency and dogmatism, but the shift to the Covenant was maybe not necessary. The Covenant Carbine is the mid-range answer to the human battle rifle, and it fires with apparently the same technology as the fuel rod cannon in miniature, as it fires 36 smaller rounds. It is semi-automatic, and does not have the accuracy of the battle rifle, but I love it. I know that it has the same problems as the beam rifle, in the sense that it is a hit-scan weapon from a distance, but I believe its lower damage makes it more palatable. I use the carbine more often than the battle rifle. I prefer the semi-automatic firing mode. I like the sound, the look of the tracer, and the impact. The carbine is another new precision weapon, and changes the overall feel of how combat operates in Halo 2. If we haven't mentioned the fuel rod cannon, we should probably do so now. The fuel rod cannon is finally usable by both the Arbiter and the Chief, and contains 5 rounds and a 2x magnification. The weapon is insanely strong when used by a player, who can dump rounds quickly into a small area, killing basically anything, including hunters, in the volley. The rapidity of the shots, and the way it stuns enemies, does more than many other weapons. One of its downsides is in the way that the fuel rods can actually ricochet at certain angles, which can cause team killing or suicide if the player is not careful. The light emitted from the splash damage is very blinding as well. The fuel rod cannon, like I did with the rocket launcher, is often something I would use as soon as possible, so I could justify picking up the weapons, only to switch to a mainstay. With only 2 weapon slots, a heavy weapon is difficult to justify holding for very long. Likely other players know that as well. Better to use it while one is still alive. If I am aware of a difficult fight coming in the future, I might hold on to these weapons. Sometimes, given the small geography, I do not pick it up at all. Since I am using the original graphics and score, you are going to hear the original guitar piece during the Banshee dogfighting, rather than the anniversary, which I dabble into but do not linger in. The Banshee has received much the same uplift of Covenant vehicles, where it has a slower base speed than human vehicles, but can boost into faster registers. Equally, the Banshee is given a series of aerial maneuvers that can be activated, likely to ward off locked-on rockets. I think that this dialectic shift from action to reaction with layering mechanics makes the Halo combat a deeply enriching one. For the purposes of the combat in the campaign, much of these options are nice flavor, but given the lack of proficient AI and the existence of dominant strategies, it does not land nearly as well as in multiplayer. Perhaps Bungie's secret dream with Destiny was to make the parity between PvE and PvP one that was so transparent that it felt seamless. But here the Banshee doing aerial rolls left or right or up does little better than simply boosting out of harm's way. The Banshee's fuel rod cannon still has to be fired with foreknowledge of how the projectile travels, adding some skill. The old ability to hover by holding the back button has been abandoned. When holding back in Halo 2, instead the Banshee drops like a bag of bricks. The Arbiter is given the mission of escorting a Phantom through the exterior of the installation. But unlike the escort mission in Keys, the Phantom is effectively invincible. A player need only wait for the Phantom to do its work. Here I do no such thing, but later in the campaign there will be another escort mission where I do. On Legendary runs through Halo 2, or with Lasso, meaning legendary difficulty, and also all skulls on, it is an obvious tactic to avoid and simply let the friendly AI, if they are invincible, do their thing. This would be pushed to its limit in Halo Reach, where the fellow Spartans of Noble Team assist the player in each mission and never die. While it is not an escort mission, it does bring up the possibility of invincible friendlies and its effect on the Halo series. I am grateful in the Arbiter level for some combat variety. As we come to the middle of the campaign, the variety of encounters plummets, and we stay in that valley for a long time. We get some nice blips, but until the great journey we are poised to suffer. So I cannot sit here and say they do not appreciate it. I think in both the Arbiter and in Halo Reach's New Alexandria, the use of an invincible aerial teammate is necessary, or else the player might be put into a checkpoint block that they cannot get out of.
What is it? That stench. I've smelled it before.
The Oracle is the mission that reintroduces the Flood. In my mind, this mission is a miserable one for a couple of reasons. Firstly, we have our first boss encounter in the form of the Heretic. While I do not like boss fights in Halo full stop, I can concede that this is the best one in Halo 2. Getting to the boss fight invites a string of encounters against the Flood that not only reuses level design assets of the place that we just fought in, but we also do not have any compelling fighting arenas with the Flood. There is a much smaller buildup of tension compared to the original Flood reveal in Halo 1, which is fine, considering both the player and the characters know what it is. That stench, I've smelled it before, the Elite General says. Another problem is a big one for me, and that is the arena that the Arbiter fights in at the beginning of this level. Okay, editor's note. So for some reason I mixed up the laboratory set piece with the elevator set piece. I thought one came before the other, so it's actually the elevator that comes first in this level, rather than the laboratory. I apologize for that, but they're both terrible, so I think the logic that I use still stands. Okay, thank you. Goodbye. For some inordinate reason, this combat encounter seems to go on for a very, very long time. Why this is, I'm not sure. The arena itself, once you drop down, makes it so that you are at the whim of Flood coming in from the door above and from the ground level. Geometrically, there is not a lot going on in this room. There are platforms that a player can fight from that slightly restrict Flood movement, and on one of these you can find a plasma turret. Long story short, the time spent in these quarters does not justify the space. That phrase is one we could use for a variety of encounters in the middle section of Halo 2's campaign. Let's talk about changes to the Flood. Instead of the Flood reanimating on their own and at random, a new feature was added where a spore has to reinfect the body. However, a player can prevent this by burning or destroying the bodies. The fellow elites mention as much as a way to signpost what is happening. Veteran players know that the elite sword has an energy cost of only 2 or 3 when killing Flood, and it also burns the bodies instantly, making it basically necessary for encounters like this. As far as the types of bodies we are fighting, there is nothing new. We have the anthropomorphized versions of elites and marines, and they are capable of melee attacks, jumping, and using a variety of weapons. In the case of Halo 2, they can use stationary gun turrets and vehicles, which is a hilarious notion. I think these features relegates them to simply another enemy. Their erratic movement in these vehicles is a nice change, and certainly fun and funny to watch, but imagining the hand-eye coordination for operating vehicles does not strike me as a good idea for the Flood. Beyond that, we have our carriers, who still explode when shot enough, and their spores that they unleash now have an added layer of danger if they find bodies. Thanks to our new melee system, it feels easier to connect with spores when trying to strike them, and their slow movement and floaty lurching still makes them easy to kite around. Our next major set piece is an elevator ride, one that also seems to go on for a very long time. The design of the elevator itself is nice enough, where the engineering functionality of the facility continues to impress, but the problem of the laboratory continues here. Even though we are moving, we are effectively stationary, making this little better than an on-rails vehicle scene in other games. or a firefight mode with moving parts. It does no good to be conciliatory towards this. The Oracle ranks pretty low among the community, I think, for a great deal of fighting that feels like it lacks context. We arrived to kill the heretic, yes, yet now we're fighting the Flood. Why this is, especially considering that we were just flying earlier, makes it easy to balk at. Why didn't the Arbiter and the rest of the crew leave and fly to some other entrance? As far as combat is concerned, the Flood arrive from only a handful of places as they climb up the sides of the elevator shaft and make great leaps from occasional horizontal struts. The player, granted, ends up looking up and around in novel ways compared to other scenarios, but it is not completely original, as the newly created drone enemies can easily cause a player to be forced to look around vertically as well as horizontally. And we have been kept in one place in a similar way with the Outskirts courtyard encounter. As I go on in this commentary, I will attempt to give the campaign the benefit of the doubt, as I rack my brain coming up with each set piece and its novelty. In Halo 1, elevators were for transit only, not for fighting. So I should concede that Halo 2 at least invites combat into this for a more kinetic experience. Once the player makes it to the heretic, we find him locked tight behind an energy barrier. The Arbiter has the idea to cut the cables that suspend the refining station above the storm. We have somewhat of a logic objective similar to the Maw, where the game will not proceed until the player cuts 3 wires on the roof. The objective is much simpler than the Maw, thankfully, and has the nice added touch of slanting the whole facility in a realistic way when each cable is cut. Upon detaching the station, the character enters a low-gravity situation as they are falling with the facility. This feeling does not last, however, and the game eventually resumes its usual feel. Here you'll notice that I jump from the elevator all the way to the bottom, a feat impossible in the first Halo. That is because Halo 2 has no fall damage, per se. If you fall from a high enough ledge, you will instantly die. Luckily, this fall does not have enough height. Thanks to the Arbiter's powers with active camouflage, this path to the heretic is simpler than it seems. A player can rush through these moments, which is good, because quite a lot of this art design is rudimentary. The station is falling apart, which is also nice, and the added blinking lights and sense of urgency is well made. My issue is more with the way that levels are arranged in Halo 2. In Outskirts and Metropolis, we had 2 levels back-to-back with a similar aesthetic. This is unlike in Halo 1, where each mission brought with it a nice spin. The Covenant ship in Truth and Reconciliation looks nothing like the installation from Halo, and even though Silent Cartographer still has Forerunner facilities, they do not have the same color palette or design as Assault on the Control Room. Here we have another binary mission setup, with the Heretic and with the Oracle, and the amount of time in this dreary color palette, with rudimentary staircases, arenas, and elevator set pieces, can only work for so long. The arena is the hangar bay we've seen before, but with a Seraph fighter parked inside. It provides enough cover, which is good, because the Heretic is a mobile fighter who uses jetpacks and holograms to overwhelm the player. What I think is fascinating is the stereotypical boss retreat to make time for the ads. This sort of thing is almost cliché in modern gaming.
Ten, heretic. Arbiter, I would rather die by your hand than let the prophets lead me to slaughter. Who has taught you these lies? The Oracle.
Hello, I am 343 Guilty Spark. I am the monitor of Installation 04.
Ask the Oracle about Halo. How they would sacrifice us all for nothing.
More questions? Splendid. I would be happy to assist you.
The elites are blind, Arbiter. But
I am a gamer who chases after novelty, and so it gets harder and harder to play the same genre twice, when that genre leans on mechanics. Of course, the problem with what I just said is that many genres are just that. We identify them by their mechanics, and for most consumers, a game has to be associative with others. If you liked X, maybe you will like Y. I think this made the concept of a boss fight easy for Bungie to implement, as many gamers understand their role in defeating the boss to progress the story. I think the Canarins podcast said it best, however, when they reminded the audience that many normal Halo fights tend to feel like a boss fight in any other game, whether it is hunters, or a charging elite, or a pack of enemies blocking us from our path. These represent key moments in other games that Bungie can do with their hands tied behind their back. Sure, Bungie leaned into gaming in general, but they did not lean into their wheelhouse of boss fights. In Destiny, it seems like Bungie changed a lot of their identity in order to provide more role-playing boss-like encounters in the form of raids. Bungie seems less interested in set pieces and more interested in doubling down on cinematic narrative design and the fundamentals of their shooting, with perhaps some logic twists. As far as the Heretic, he is easily dispatched, which won't be the case for many players for later bosses, but we'll get to that in time.
So it is. Come, you're leaving the system.
Report!
Both engine cores have spun to zero. We're drifting.
Archer pods are cold. I'll need to rekey the system.
Do it and find out where we are.
Sorry for the quick jump, Sergeant. You in one piece?
I'm good. Chief?
We're fine.
Ma'am, there's an object coming into view now.
Cortana, what exactly am I looking at? That is another Halo.
Say what?
So this is what my father found. I thought Halo was some sort of super weapon. It is. If activated, this ring will cause destruction on a galactic scale. I want all the information you've got on the first Halo. Schematics, topography, whatever. I don't care if I have the clearance or not. Yes, ma'am. Where's our target?
The enemy ship is stopped above the ring, ma'am. We're going to pass right over it.
Perfect. Given what we know about this ring, it's even more important that we capture the Prophet of Regret. Find out why he came to Earth, why he came here. Chief, take first platoon. Hard drop. Secure a landing zone. Sergeant, load up 2 flights of Pelicans and follow them in.
Aye, aye, ma'am.
Till I can move and fight, I'm going to keep a low profile. Once you leave the ship, you're on your own.
Understood.
Over the target in 5.
Hang on to your helmet. Mind the bump. Possibly make any more noise? I guess so.
Sir, we gotta neutralize those turrets!
With the success of Halo 1, there was bound to be another Halo ring encounter. In the previous game, Halo 1 invited the idea that several rings would corroborate detonation, and that would subsequently stop all life. What is less discussed is the question of what exactly happens to life in the space where the first Halo was destroyed. If we infer that each ring covers a certain part of the galaxy, and the part of the first Halo now lies without a ring, does this not mean that there is a gap in the structure where life could live on should the rings be activated? I digress. Once again, one shouldn't get too involved in the weeds here of Halo's story. I think, rather than thinking of the past, we instead, like the story, should be focused on the present, where Regret has run away to another Halo in the hope of lighting it. In Delta Halo, we get a sort of callback to Silent Cartographer in the form of a hot drop, only this time it's with orbital drop shock troopers. ODSTs seemed to be the midpoint between basic Marines and the Spartan class of soldiers. Master Chief is a Spartan 2, a far larger and more brusque version than the Spartan 3s of Noble Team in Halo Reach, apart from George, who still remains a Spartan 2. Unfortunately, the Halo 2 manual makes no mention of ODSTs, but we'll see them get their spotlight in the spin-off game after Halo 3. As far as actual mechanical differences, we don't see many. We can even hear similar voice actors. Delta Halo, while it has a hot drop like Silent Cartographer, is certainly not a callback to that level in any other sense. Delta Halo has the Chief land with ODSTs and fight to prepare a landing pad for Pelican dropships. What results is a brisk and fun assault through what look like Mayan ruins. We have a couple stationary turrets we have not seen before, and these fire the same plasma as on the Phantom. They have protective shields on the front, something that shade turrets did not have. Once again, grunts can mount these, leveraging their utility as all-around types who can quickly escalate a combat encounter if given the opportunity. After the player dispatches the enemy holding the ruins, the player must, once again, fight off waves of dropships bringing enemies down. Rather than bring the dropship danger close, these tend to stay much higher, giving the player plenty of time to take down smaller enemies as they descend the 100 feet or so to ground level. This is another tedious use of smaller geometry, when in Halo 1 the game wastes no time in getting the player into a Warthog to explore. Only after perhaps double the amount of time does Delta Halo do the same. We are not in the Warthog for very long, before the player arrives in a control room where they can activate a bridge to the other side. Notice here we have a similar mechanical objective to the second Halo, where we activated a light bridge, only here the enemies are either across the bridge in a wraith or fortified in the control room. There's plenty of space on this side of the bridge that I feel goes unused in this encounter, though I suppose there are several ghosts that the player can fight with the Warthog if they so choose. But the sooner the player activates the bridge, the sooner the dropship brings down the Scorpion tank. A second tank section is better than just one from Halo 1, so I'm impressed with that. But I cannot deny that this tank encounter feels much like Metropolis, only the difference is in some twisty, turny angles. There are perhaps one or two places where the Scorpion can either go up or down, but this does not dramatically change the expected outcome by all that much. What is more appealing is the chance for the player to come across spawning enemies deep in these Mayan-like ruins and to get the jump on the player. In co-op, this gives the second player a job to do, in providing infantry cover with whoever remains of the ODST soldiers. I think it is a marginally better scenario to the bridge, but the Covenant ghosts just cannot compete with the speed and ferocity of the Scorpion cannon and coaxial gun. Even on Heroic, the enemy just melted in my presence. I died plenty in Halo 2's campaign, but not dying in either tank moment proves that either Bungie wants to give the player a breather in these more fun experiences, or the Scorpion is just too strong for PvE. Comparing the second Halo mission to Delta Halo makes the latter seem like a much shorter mission. Indeed, after the tank encounter, and after fighting through several tight indoor sections, we come across a waterfall, where a Jackal sniper waits once again to let us kill him and take the beam rifle. From here on out, you're going to see me lean heavily into the beam rifle for many encounters, even encounters that the beam rifle has no business being in. Of course, on mouse and keyboard, this is inevitable, but on console back in 2004, I remember still relying on the beam rifle. I am of the opinion that if you remove the beam rifle entirely from Halo 2's campaign, it would be a better experience. Places would seem larger, and the rest of the arsenal would breathe a little better into the spaces, both large and small. Right before the end of the level, the landing ends up being swarmed by drones. It's a strange place to have drones attack considering how little cover there is, and how little resting places there are for the drones as well. To me it seems like yet another attempt to get the player halted to stretch out the scenery. At the end, the player faces honor guards, special elites who protect the Prophet. We've seen their design in the introductory cutscene, the Heretic, and we will see it more and more as we progress deeper into the Covenant hierarchy. Honor guards can be terrifying with swords, which some are wielding now, but in a game with dual wielding and better precision, it means more control for the player to dispatch these enemies, even in such a close setting. One elephant in the room that we can talk about is the parallels of the Covenant to the fear of religious fanaticism in the 2000s. 9/11 occurred just before Halo 1's release, and it cannot be denied that when we hear the Prophet of the Covenant singing what Cortana says is religious literature, and the idea that the Great Journey is effectively a form of suicide, it bears some resemblance to Western interpretations of radical Islam. In the first Halo game, no word is mentioned on motivations. In fact, it says specifically that humanity does not understand their motivations. But in the Halo 2 manual, we have the introduction of prophets and a highly segmented society in the Covenant. Had 9/11 not happened, and had the war in Afghanistan and Iraq not plunged the United States into a strange place geopolitically, I'm confident in saying that Halo 2's story might have been far different.
Wait, go back. That's what I thought he said. The Prophet of Regret is planning to activate Halo.
Are you sure?
I shall light this holy ring, release its cleansing flame, and burn a path into the divine beyond.
Pretty much.
Commander, we've got a problem.
So I hear. But from what I understand, the Prophet will need an object, the Index, to activate the ring. I've located a library similar to the one you found on the first Halo. If the rings work the same way, the index should be inside.
I'll bet the Covenant are thinking the exact same thing.
Then we better beat them to it, Sergeant. Extract your men and meet me at the library.
Yes, ma'am.
I'll secure the index tube. You take out the Prophet. He's given us all the intel we need.
Regret feels like part 2 of a 2-part level. Once again, you'll notice similar aesthetics, and you carry over your weapons from one mission to another. At the beginning of the mission, the player learns that they plan to activate Halo, giving Miranda the idea to attempt to retrieve the index, the key that is used to activate Halo, from another library. The path of the Chief tracking down the Prophet leads to this moment, so we may say that the Regret mission is the turning point, in a similar way to Assault on the Control Room with Cortana, where she urges the Chief to stop Keyes before it's too late, and they release the Flood. In my opinion, despite the community ranking of A for the mission, I feel as though it is one of the worst. The fighting arenas leading up to the gondola experience feel bizarre, and are bridged with underwater sections where we are forced to sit through exposition on the Covenant and their communication with each other. Not only is space given over to the Covenant in the form of the Arbiter, but the Chief's plot is also subjugated. If I never play this level again, I would be very happy with that. Last game we talked about Bungie's reticence to use water, and with these 2 levels I'm going to have to eat my words. There are occasions in each game where rivers and flowing water are present. There's Winter Contingency in Halo Reach, Sierra 117 in Halo 3, and these 2 missions in Halo 2. Water exists as window dressing rather than a core feature of the environment, but it is a nice change. Here in Regret, a kind of Wonkavator, as a reference to Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, takes the Chief underwater. The fighting between uses hip-high water, and you'll see a very embarrassing aspect of the anniversary graphics where I shoot the water. In video game parlance, gamers will often shoot the water to see how realistic a game is. When Cyberpunk 2077 launched infamously bugged and clearly unready for release, shooting the water did nothing. This was compared to Grand Theft Auto 5, for example, among a number of open-world staples we come to expect from urban environments. So when I shoot the water in both graphics, only the old 2004 responds. This is likely a choice of resources, as water does not occur often. But Bungie back in 2004 thought of it, so more power to them to take a resource like water and work with it methodically. I'm slightly impressed with certain fighting arenas in this level, like the underground one with the hunters, drones, and honor guards. There are a couple jackals in here as well, and even though the room feels slightly large for what you do in it, I like the strangeness in its ramps, height levels, and so forth. I think where I am not impressed is when there is any sort of long linear hallway, which occurs in these hip-high water sections. Throwing enemies at the player in these moments, as I have mentioned before, feels like padding. I think that much of Halo 2 does not hold up because of the way that Bungie decided to handle loading assets, and it meant more control over where the player is at any given moment. This leads us to yet another fight, where we are carried by the game from one place to another. This long gondola helps to provide more narrative exposition, but what does the player gain from yet another transition fight like this? Elevators, gondolas. These may make the player think they are moving, but movement is relative. They are not necessarily causing the movement. They have agency, but only on this gondola, and when enemies arrive, the amount of space does not provide as much agency as one might think, and it certainly does not hold a candle to the spaces in Halo 1. I hope throughout this commentary I do not sound like a broken record. With this gondola ride, we are facing Banshees, flying elites, and another gondola with enemies. As we approach the temple, we fight grunts on turrets, and, once again, jackal snipers.
That's the largest Covenant fleet I've ever seen. The largest anyone's ever seen. Get inside the temple and kill Regret before it can stop us.
As we approach the Regret boss fight, we had better encapsulate just what a miserable decision this was by Bungie. Boarding vehicles was a big mechanical change to the series, and in my mind was a good improvement. But boarding a boss enemy as a necessary component to defeating him was an obvious cock-up. Punching Regret to death is an awkward and unseemly affair, and it does not feel very badass. Having to get close to him and board him several times depending on difficulty is also not badass, and though the Prophet can teleport and reappear at whim, one wonders why he doesn't simply teleport out of the fight to live another day. All weapons do not work on him, though I have read that apparently a sword and a rocket launcher can damage him before boarding to land the final blow, but they have to be used in a certain way. These are attempts by players to cheese a boss fight, meaning to use tactics not originally designed by the developers when planning a boss as a means to kill it. What I think is more egregious is the use of continuous enemies to bolster the fight. I do understand that, in Halo, the supply of weapons for the player comes from enemies, but the conditions of the fight make it so that weapons are not necessary for the boss. Compared to the boss fights of Destiny, it's clear that Bungie leaned on previous mechanics of what to expect from a boss. As the Halo fandom walkthrough is correct in pointing out, Regret is a boss that features many mechanics a player has seen before, on Legendary, and in co-op. This set piece reaches absurdist heights, where the players may have to bore the Prophet several times, and then somehow make it out alive when surrounded by Covenant dropping down. Here I am able to luck out on Heroic and perform this boss fight easily, and this is on a first attempt after many years. But notice that I do not fight anyone else, and I am able to use my headphones to accurately locate where the Prophet is. The clarity of my screen and the quality of stereo sound perhaps helped in this, as did my foreknowledge of how the boss fight works. The introductory player, we have to remember, knows none of this. So in their mind, old strategies work. Being patient and killing every enemy methodically still works in their mind because we have spent 1.5 games using it. But we know that here, it does not work. I am surprised that Cortana does not just outright say, "We don't have time for this. More Covenant are coming, and they'll keep coming until you beat the Prophet to death." Why hide these mechanics from the player? Guilty by omission, I suppose.
On our position. We need to get out of here.
This is not your grave, but you are welcome in it. This is unprecedented. Unacceptable.
A hierarch is dead, Commander.
His murderer was within our grasp. If you had not withdrawn our phantoms...
Are you questioning my decision?
No, Holy One. I only wish to express my concern that the brutes...
Recommissioning the Guard was a radical step. But recent events have made it abundantly clear that the elites can no longer guarantee our safety.
I shall relay your decision to the Council.
Politics, how tiresome. Do you know, Arbiter, the elites have threatened to resign, to quit the High Council, because of this exchange of hats?
We have always been your protectors.
These are trying times for all of us.
Even as the humans' annihilation filled us with satisfaction, the loss of one of the sacred rings racked our hearts with grief.
Putting aside our sorrow, we renewed our faith in the prophecy that other rings would be found, and see how our faith has been rewarded.
Halo, its divine wind will rush through the stars, propelling all who are worthy along the path to salvation.
But how to start this process? For ages we searched for one who might unlock the secrets of the rings. An oracle. And with your help, we found it.
With appropriate humility, we plied the oracle with questions, and it, with clarity and grace, has shown us the key.
You will journey to the surface of the ring and retrieve this sacred icon. With it, we shall fulfill our promise.
Salvation for all.
And begin the great journey
Once the shield is down, we will head straight to the library. I do not wish to keep the Hierarchs waiting.
The human that killed the Prophet of Regret. Who was it?
Who do you think?
The demon is here?
Why? Looking for a little payback?
Retrieving the icon is my only concern.
Of course.
Apparently, in development, there's also a missing mission somewhere in here as well, as the totally bizarre way that the Gravemind appears to snatch the Master Chief at the end of the Regret mission feels obviously shoehorned in. If a player was dumbstruck by the story beats in the first half of Halo 2, by this point, they will be speechless. The elites have been removed as the honor guards, replaced with brutes, who look absolutely hilarious in the honor guard clothing. The Arbiter is sent down to retrieve the sacred icon, which is the Index, putting the player on an intercept course with Miranda Keyes and Sergeant Johnson, who last mission informed Cortana and the Chief that they would attempt to get it before the Covenant. The killing of the Prophet of Regret did cause a rupture in the hierarchy of the alien races, and it will lead erratically to a kind of civil war. And in a way, the Master Chief really does fulfill his nickname as a demon, sowing discord into the Covenant ranks. As we have already seen, the tension between the brutes and the elites was already present, and simply needed a catalyst. Sacred Icon is another one of those levels that begins a two-part story of the Arbiter fighting Flood to make it to the Index. As far as comparing it to the library, it is a far better series for variety, but I'm not going to sit here and tell you that these are polished gems. In fact, these two missions rank in the C tier for the community. The reason you'll see me skip quite a lot of the first part of this mission is largely because I can. One of the differences in Sacred Icon is the need to shoot a pylon that opens up a drop below, and tunnels that bear some similarity, I suppose, to Luke Skywalker's trip through tunnels in Empire Strikes Back. But while Luke's trip is harrowing and horrifying for the way he ends up suspended over a giant expanse, the trip down feels awkward and silly, even with Marty O'Donnell and Michael Salvatore doing their hard work to bring some terror to the whole thing. The use of fog comes up a lot in the following missions with the Flood, notably in certain sections of the mission High Charity. I am a sucker for effects like fog, so I'm willing to cut Bungie some slack here, but I cannot deny that many of these close quarters encounters between the vertical drops are just not good. The sense of scale of the library, its likely one and only positive quality, has been replaced with tiny and claustrophobic spaces where sentinels can respawn from holes in the wall. Sacred Icon is an ugly level, with deep browns and color totally sapped from the experience, unlike the library's deep and rich blues, to contrast to other levels. As you can see, it is disturbingly easy to skip many sections of these two levels, because the levels seem just as short as the Arbiter's cloaking ability. For a novice player, finding the next pylon can be a taxing affair, but for a veteran who knows the strange twists and turns, even after years, this knowledge makes these missions a breeze, for the most part. But I must say that, even in 2004, when I played the game solo on Legendary, I remember performing the same measures. I think mixing the Arbiter with the Flood is a poor idea. Swords are everywhere for the Arbiter, which takes care of short-range problems, and since most of these levels are short-range, with the exception of some vehicle sections, much of the Flood loses their lethal behavior. More pressing to the Arbiter may be the new Sentinel enemies. In order to enter the library, the Arbiter must take down a shield generator. A new Sentinel enemy, an Enforcer, stands in the player's way. The Enforcer has two shields up front, floats in the air like a sentinel, and has two large arms that can be used to crush vehicles in a vice-like grip. The Enforcer also shoots out mortars like the Wraith, with many more projectiles more akin to a missile strike. Getting close also causes the Enforcer to fire twin red needles, a very bizarre weapon indeed. All of this would be dangerous to the Arbiter if he were easily visible, but my strategy of hiding goes relatively well. So well, in fact, that the game destroys the Enforcer for me. Tartarus certainly didn't think of that meta when he told me to lurk in the shadows. What follows next is yet another gondola scene, though in visuals and presentation, this one is better than the one in Regret. Having these missions adjacent to each other, however, really bogs the experience down in terms of mission variety. Remember that each mission in Halo has its own hook and dedicated experience, turning the whole campaign into some kind of three-course dinner. Rescue operations, exploration, big action scenes, a horrifying new enemy, and when the game decides to repeat geometry or ideas, it does so with long stretches between them. Once again, you'll see my hurry up and wait strategy as I make my way to the last holdout with the Elite General in a circular arena firefight. Sacred Icon is thus a level that went from small, claustrophobic, and easily skippable rooms to a gondola mission, and finally to being stuck in one place fighting Flood once again. This means that, essentially, very little is new about the Sacred Icon mission. Elites dropping from pods is a nice visual touch, and the new Enforcers added some weight and heft to the Halo Ring AI defenses. But the problem of night missions in Halo 2 is a lack of color. Certainly the game attempts with its new lighting system to invite a higher dynamic range in terms of contrast, but unless there is a rich color to show off how the contrasts interact with textures, it becomes a deflating graphics showcase. If Halo 2 is ugly, then Sacred Icon and Quarantine Zone are some of the ugliest missions. There is little to say about this final zone. It features some bottomless chasms, which might shock the player, but otherwise any sword can easily outmatch the Flood. Flood, at a distance, succumb to carbine fire fairly well to a player who looks upon a vulnerable spot.
In the center of this zone is a sacred icon critical to the great journey. I must find it.
We shall cut into the heart of this infestation, retrieve the icon, and burn any flood that stand in our way.
The parasite is not to be trifled with. I hope you know what you're doing.
The Quarantine Zone level luckily manages to improve over Sacred Icon thanks to a robust set of vehicles, including the new Covenant Spectre. Similar perhaps to the level Keys in the first Halo, Quarantine Zone has that equal sense of being an unhinged fight between multiple parties, but in this context, the combination of this atmosphere in a vehicle setting massively improves the experience. Even still, there are some caveats to the mission as a whole that I hope to break down as we go along. The Flood can now drive vehicles. While I can see the appeal of seeing these vehicles from the vantage point of a Covenant elite, the idea that Flood can operate a tank is absurd. In the original manual, 2 people apparently were required to operate the tank, or 1 cyborg. Here in the manual, as long as the human has a neural interface, they can interact with the tank. This all implies that the Scorpion tank is a rather complex piece of machinery. And yet the Flood not only pilot it, but there is a high chance that the player will be murdered violently by the Scorpion tanks. You do not see it here, but I was destroyed on multiple occasions by the tank's powerful cannon. I love it, and I hate it. It adds variety, but makes the world feel more toy-like. I don't know. By this point in the campaign, I was desperate for something different, and boy did I get it. The Spectre is the answer to the human's Warthog, and features a driver, a gunner, and 2 side seats. The top speed of the Spectre once again fluctuates between a slow, normal speed and a fast, boosted one. It also moves laterally back and forth to allow dodging and a better chance for close quarters. The Spectre turret fires rapid-fire hit-scan bolts, much like the Warthog, and has a cool, icy sound as it fires. In a later mission, you will see me take the gunner seat of a Spectre on heroic difficulty, which of course ends in disaster. So for solo play, it is once again highly advisable to drive. The player is briefly removed from vehicular play as a result of debris from the nearby structures. Once again, I attempt to move past the Flood undetected. When we encounter another vehicle section, it ends up being the best portion of this level, and one of the best in the campaign. There are bottomless chasms separating wraiths, making them difficult to remove without trying to veer around the geometry. The Covenant versus Flood versus Sentinel encounter is just absolute insanity, and is sort of one of those moments that has to be engineered. In multiplayer, particularly on maps like Zanzibar, a capture the flag game type can make the rush to the base create these sorts of wild and frenzied battles. Whether a player chooses fight or flight, simply inhabiting these moments is enough to elevate the campaign into feeling like a part of something bigger, something I mentioned as a big positive for the level 2 betrayals. Aesthetically and mechanically, there are some aspects of Quarantine Zone that attempt to mimic this mission. I think 2 Betrayals wins out for the scale of the mission, as it expanded Assault in the Control Room to the skies, but the color and tone also benefited from a night mission. Even in these large set pieces, the fighting feels tighter, and not in a good way. They lack space and breadth.
Or humans. They must be after the icon. On your way, Arbiter. I'll deal with these beasts.
I see that coward didn't join you. I'll do what I can to keep the flood off your back.
But ultimately, the experience ends in yet another gondola set piece. The Arbiter fights the Flood with a handful of elites who, if you give them swords, can do fairly well. If you don't, the elites love getting into a fist fight with the Flood, which does nothing, and so the elites can die quickly. Flood periodically jump off of overhanging platforms that intersect with the gondola, but they can also come from below. And once again, there is a strange effect on physics for both grenades and projectiles. Something else you may notice throughout the commentaries of Halo 1 and Halo 2 is the problem of the AI. In the first commentary, I hinted that the friendly AI seemed to have problems functioning correctly. The same holds for enemy AI. Certain set pieces, especially in 2 betrayals, did not seem to start. While fighting through one narrow tunnel, for example, I knew that a Flood was supposed to round the corner with a rocket launcher. This did not happen. And there were several squads of both Covenant and Flood who were supposed to fight, but for some reason they stood totally still facing each other. This occurred again, you might have seen, in the Mission Keys. This gondola ride sort of has this similar problem, where the AI does not feel like it knows what it is doing. This is problematic in a commentary because I am not using the original product. I cannot really know where the problem originates from. Is it the move from the console to Windows Vista version? Is it a problem of 343 in its anniversary edition? Was it a problem bringing the Master Chief Collection to PC? Or is it an original problem by Bungie? What is so terrible about this is that the question of difficulty becomes a moving target. Hopefully I'll bring this up more in the future with a mission in Halo Reach, but as you're watching, bear in mind that we are dealing with a composite of developers who touched hands on this product, and this is across multiple decades, so it stands to reason that the tech debt would be rather high. Combining all these experiences into a single product was bound to create some parity issues, and with so much time away from the code, perhaps a zero-sum game sets in, where supposed fixes in one way only invite problems in another. The double cross by Tartarus, turned into an order by the Prophets, is a bizarre one. Perhaps the Prophets felt a little threatened by the Arbiter's racial loyalty towards his own kin. Whatever. Somehow it allows him to also freefall into the Gravemind's tentacles, causing us to enter the third and final act of this campaign.
You know, your father never asked me for help either.
The index is secure.
Mackenzie, Perez, how's our exit? You hear me, Marines? We got trouble. How you doing?
Sergeant, stay down! Johnson, you all right? Johnson!
Excellent work, Arbiter. The Hierarchs will be pleased.
The Icon is my responsibility.
Was your responsibility. Now it is mine. A bloody fate awaits you and the rest of your incompetent race. And I, Tartarus, chieftain of the brutes, will send you to it.
When the Prophets learn of this, they will take your head.
When they learn. Fool. They ordered me to do it.
What is that?
I am a monument to all your sins.
Relax. I'd rather not piss this thing off.
Demon. This one is machine and nerve, and has its mind concluded. This one is but flesh and faith, and is the more deluded.
Kill me or release me, parasite. But do not waste my time with talk.
There is much talk, and I have listened through rock and metal and time. Now I shall talk, and you shall listen.
Greetings. I am 2401, Penitent Tangent. I am the monitor of Installation 05.
And I am the Prophet of Regret, Counselor Most High, Hierarch of the Covenant.
A reclaimer? Here? At last. We have much to do. This facility must be activated if we are to control this outbreak.
Stay where you are. Nothing can be done until my sermon is complete.
Not true. This installation has a successful utilization record of 1.2 trillion simulated in one actual. It is ready to fire on demand.
Of all the objects our lords left behind, there are none so worthless as these oracles. They know nothing of the great journey!
And you know nothing about containment. You have demonstrated complete disregard for even the most basic protocols.
This one's containment. And this one's great journey are the same. Your prophets have promised you freedom from a doomed existence, but you will find no salvation on this ring. Those who built this place knew what they wrought. Do not mistake their intent, or all will perish as they did before.
This thing is right. Halo is a weapon. Your prophets are making a big mistake.
Your ignorance already destroyed one of the sacred rings, demon. It shall not harm another.
If you will not hear the truth, then I will show it to you. There is still time to stop the key from turning, but first it must be found. You will search one likely spot, and you will search another. Fate had us meet as foes, but this ring will make us brothers.
We are, all of us, gravely concerned. The release of the parasite was unexpected, unfortunate, but there is no need to panic. In truth, this is a time to rejoice. A moment that all the Covenant should savor. For the sacred icon has been found. With it, our path is clear, our entry into the divine beyond guaranteed. The great journey is nigh, and nothing, not even the flood, can stop it.
Boo.
Kill the demon!
The Gravemind is a ridiculous feature of the Halo story. Whenever I see the Gravemind, I cannot help but think of Little Shop of Horrors, which may have been a direct influence. The whole idea that the Flood has a sentient being guiding them is, I guess, sort of like the idea about the Zerg in StarCraft, as they are guided by an Overmind, and eventually Sarah Kerrigan, the Queen of Blades. The Flood, like the Zerg, incorporate other species and their genetic DNA into their own. The use of the Gravemind is to invite the Arbiter and the Chief together into an armistice, where we are able to assimilate, pun intended, The two stories of the Halo ring into one disastrous conclusion. The Flood, of course, has an incentive to stay alive, and so there is a short-term solution of working together. But unlike in Halo 3, the Flood do not work with the Chief and Arbiter as allies. Also strangely, the Gravemind has the ability to teleport both the Arbiter and the Chief directly, at roughly the same point in the campaign as it was used in Halo 1. This tautology of the game has strange repeating moments like this, some which work, and some which don't. People probably barely notice these repetitions, and perhaps the developers did not even notice. Sometimes repetitions are supposed to happen, and are leaned on, like in the case of Folklore, where Goldilocks, for example, must inspect 3 times before finding the right middle ground. But here I think it is simply a convenience. I hate this first section of Gravemind, and as a whole I despise this mission. It is, for the most part, a straight line, and nothing in the geometry can really convince me that it isn't. This is the first time we fight the Brutes, and for a portion of it, we are fighting Covenant without a precision weapon. For whatever reason, the Brutes seem like an underdeveloped enemy in Halo 2. Sure, they have a behavior attached to them in going berserk, but they soak up a ton of hits, and what's more, they do not seem to react when they are shot. Throughout this mission, as I am firing, there's no response from them except to shoot back. I find the Brutes in Halo 2 to be serviceable, but they lack the charm and imposing nature of elites. Instead, what we get is a certain annoyance, and this beginning section is miserable for how many fights the player is supposed to fight. In case you haven't noticed, the amount of times you are forced to stay in one spot and fight has gone up considerably in Halo 2 compared to Halo 1. In the first Halo, we had the second mission with the Marines. We had Truth and Reconciliation at the bottom of Gravelift and inside the Covenant vessel, and we have the Guilty Spark level with the introduction of the Flood. We have several moments in the library, and we have the beginning of 2 betrayals. So I won't deny that Halo 1 does have many moments, but the added negative to this moment is how vulnerable the Chief is. Until a Brute arrives in the upper parts of the Council Chamber with a carbine, fighting with a Needler and other plasma weapons is difficult with Brutes. For most of the time, if the player gets into a fistfight with the Brutes when they go berserk, the Brute will win, and if they are moving fast enough, it makes it difficult to hit them with plasma. It's always sort of this in Halo 2. It's 1 step forward, 2 steps back. The following sections of the mission are just painful. Linear hallways, not too much variety, all in the middle of the Covenant's homeworld. It was a great opportunity to explore what a Covenant city like this, especially this mobile one, would look like. What we have instead is only the parts of the world that do not feel lived in which there are many hallways and transitory pathways that lead from one hallway to the next. In the middle of this fight, we do get the prison quarters, and we feel like Han and Luke in the Death Star, saving Princess Leia. It seems as though Miranda and Johnson, taken captive, are somewhere in High Charity. The Master Chief fights through several elevator sections, which allow the game once again to block off previous sections and unload them from memory, so as to load new settings. The fighting in the prison is fine enough. We finally get a sense of verticality, both in this mission as well as later, when a mixed race war goes on in outdoor spaces. The use of a bottomless chasm here so as to separate the levels of the prison from the central elevator is nice, as is the U-shaped design that allows for people on different levels to shoot at each other, making this all a fairly fun encounter. Setting the Marines free has them picking up the closest weapons, except for the Brute Shot, likely due to its size and power. The Brute Shot is a grenade launcher weapon that will see several tweaks throughout the series. It has a bladed end for stronger melee attacks, and also has a very rustic and analog reloading mechanism, further adding to its old-fashioned design. The slow reload, combined with the opportunity to fire all the grenades quickly, means that there is a chance for considerable downtime. In a game like Halo 2 that increased the speed of combat, this can leave the player very vulnerable. As such, shooting from a distance to soften targets, or switching so as to clean up the rest, is better than using it perhaps in the middle of a firefight. I tend to enjoy the Brute Shot for how different it is. It can be ricocheted like human grenades, bounced off at strange angles to allow for better placement before detonation. The most fun I've ever had with the Brute Shot was in multiplayer in Halo 3 on the map Sandtrap, which featured 2 UNSC elephants, which were giant mobile bases. Every player had a Brute Shot and fired them from the elephant like cannons from a sailing vessel. Great fun. Here in the campaign, like other explosive weapons, I tend to use them quickly and exchange them for other staple weapons when they're empty. Compared to other weapons, the Brute Shot in the Gravemind level is actually frequent enough that the player could hold on to the Brute Shot for most if not all of the mission. Because of its slower projectile speed and arc of travel, it makes it far more difficult to use in later missions with longer ranges, so your mileage may vary when using the Brute Shot in these moments. Otherwise, it's a very lethal short and middle range weapon. Although I find the question of the elites and rebellion thoroughly fun for the player to fight through, given the way each member of the Covenant takes sides. I have a hard time imagining that this sort of civil war would break out at just this moment. Part of me feels as though the Flood should have arrived before this. Though the elites may have quite a large reputation as a warrior class, their role as military officers throughout the ranks would have made their position still incredibly relevant, despite the change in the honor guards. One of the problems of introducing a new race like the Brutes is that we are just unaware of how much saturation of the Brutes there is in the Covenant ranks. Like the Flood, Bungie likely thought that they needed a new enemy for Halo 2 that would only be fought later. Obviously, other enemies like drones would hopefully make up enough novelty for the first 2/3 of the game, and the Brutes and their variants could make up the end. Halo 3 would add still newer ideas, but Halo ODST and Halo Reach would pull back on new enemies per se, and would focus more on a refinement of what already existed. Brutes, as a result, exist at a midpoint between the physicality and aggression of the Flood and the mobility and fire and maneuver behaviors of elites. Because of their primate look, I never found Brutes to be in sync with the other alien races either, if only because each of them still fell back on other types of creatures. Elites and jackals are both reptilian, while drones are far more insectoid. Hunters have the strange feeling of a worm, and the prophets bear similarities to turtles. So the Covenant for the most part owe their look to reptiles, insects, amphibians, and so forth, and not as much to mammals. Perhaps this was intentional, though I wonder what a brute type would look like if Bungie had instead kept its focus on other species of animals. The Flood do eventually arrive on High Charity, which seems like an apocalyptic moment. With the humans still battling Covenant on Earth, we assume, and the Flood out in deep space invading the Covenant homeworld, we cannot deny that Halo 2 raises the stakes compared to where we started with the first game. Even still, in my mind, the Gravemind mission represents the very bottom of Halo 2's campaign. When thinking about the combat encounters in this, and their linearity, it is the cross-section of most problems in the whole game, minus the presence of gondolas or lengthy elevator combat sections.
Splinter, one of these phantoms.
The hopes of all the Covenant rest on your shoulders, Chieftain.
My faith is strong. I will not fail.
Let him be. The great journey waits for no one, brother. Not even you.
Uprising is a minor improvement, but not by much. Although this mission features several different types of set pieces with both infantry and vehicles, the labyrinthine twists and turns of the level never open up into something exploratory and fun. What is different about the progression of levels is how Uprising is obviously the first part of the Great Journey mission for its second part, but they are interweaved with the Master Chief's missions of Gravemind and High Charity. It's a nice change in scenery, one might suppose, and there are intense narrative twists in these missions that feel as though the campaign finally brings some heavier gravitas to the whole thing. As far as gameplay, which has been my goal first and foremost, we have seen most of what is on offer. That is not to say that the form of this content is not different. The Brutes and Elites have broken out in open conflict, so it brings the Arbiter great pleasure in pursuing Brutes to their deaths in a variety of circumstances. Several of these moments feel very awkward as combat encounters, particularly in one of the final arenas, but we'll come to that. One other weapon we have not talked about is the return of the Needler. One Needler was enough fun for everyone, but two really ups the enjoyment to embarrassing levels. Dual-wielding Needlers can fill the air with pink. The game has compensated by making the Needler rate of fire slightly lower. One of the things I haven't mentioned about the power of dual-wielding is how it necessarily forced weapons that could be dual-wielded to be lowered in power when held in a single hand. This is also not to mention that certain combinations of weapons, like say a needler and SMG, are an awkward mix, and not recommended due to the differing speeds of their projectiles. Yet the needler reloads quickly, still in dual-wielding mode, and the plasma weapons still overheat and reset at the same time, making human weapons awkward to dual-wield for their longer reload time. I'm quite sure that Bungie did their due diligence and heavily tested these combinations to see which ones could be dominant and others recessive, but at the end of the day, the concept of dual-wielding is such a large one that the whole game has to adjust to make space for it, and in my mind it had the knock-on effect of lowering the punch and powerful feeling of some weapons as a result. In Uprising, we witnessed some truly bizarre level design, and some of it works better than others. In one moment, the player wraps several times around a central pillar, weaving back and forth in a way that makes it seem as though Bungie is squeezing as much out of the level geometry, something we do not see often. In another scenario, we have several terraced hallways with brutes down below. It is strange to have to drop down in order to fight, and the game leans in on this by providing explosive barrels that the player can knock over. One of the benefits of Halo 2, that I suppose we have not mentioned, is the lack of repeating scenarios, nor do we see the reuse of whole levels. On paper, this is an obvious benefit. What better way for the player to feel like they are going through an epic story than to make each level feel novel and original? I think the hidden downside is the way that the campaign feels, where the set pieces of the new game end up feeling claustrophobic. To be sure, there are vehicle set pieces that are bigger and bolder, with more enemies on screen and more combat going on, but these are exceptions rather than the rule. I think Bungie saw their reuse of levels as a mistake in the first game that they wanted to correct, but in so doing they stretched themselves too thin, and ended up producing a game that had compelling moments, but was put together with far worse sections. As we come into the final stretch of the Halo 2 campaign, one comparison we can make is in the way the campaign feels as a whole. While Halo 2 does attempt those differing moments, which create a well-rounded cohesive whole, what Halo 1 perhaps did better was to more efficiently use geometry so as to bring us those moments in a manner that fools the player into thinking that they are new. The elephant in the room as the ultimate point of comparison is something I mentioned in the previous game. Why didn't Bungie use the Silent Cartographer mission as the barometer that would dictate all other missions? To me, that entire level is the encapsulation of Halo 1. There is no equivalent in Halo 2, and I hope that this comparison can help you delineate between why I love the first Halo campaign and why I dislike the second one. Much of the mystery of exploration is handled narratively in Halo 2, and I think rather poorly. At any given moment, the Chief, the Arbiter, Cortana, and the rest of the gang seem to know exactly what to do and where to go, and the level design is narrow enough that there is never any mystery to it. Equally, there is no doubling back through geometry with differing events, making the locations feel less alive. Halo 3, ODST, and Reach would all learn this lesson well, and it's one that I will try to remark upon as we go along. But that makes Halo 2 a strange outlier in its own series for not reusing assets as often. This is not the response we would typically have as players. We would think that reusing assets is not at all something that a game would want to do to please their audience, but the truth is rather more murky. Anybody who has been paying attention to the games knows that the open world game and the roguelike genre have popularized reuse, but in different ways. For the open world game, all that repetition is available in space, while in roguelikes it is put backstage and is brought out in an unfolding time. Reuse always occurs in games. The good developers are able to see when to reuse so as to maximize what makes their games enjoyable and compelling. Even with more cutscenes, Halo 2 takes about as much time to complete as Halo 1, and that takes into account an uptick in difficulty. This means that Halo 2 has strangely less, even though Bungie may have provided more. I am not suggesting that a longer playtime in a shooting campaign is always a good thing. More that I am remarking on how Bungie tried harder with their work and got less out of it. And in aggregate, the linear level design, the way the game spawns enemies to slow down the player, the way Jackal snipers make the player more cautious, all signal a game that was not as smartly designed. This does not carry over into multiplayer, as that was a huge success, and Bungie should pat themselves on the back for basically making Xbox Online multiplayer what it is today, but as a result the campaign suffered. The outdoor sections wrap back and forth, and at one moment awkwardly descend steeply. I say awkwardly, because while riding in a Ghost, I died instantly while falling, which means that the hill is so steep that I must have triggered some internal logic from the game that made it think that I had dropped into a bottomless pit. The strange level design occurs again, with a snake-like maneuver through 2 levels, featuring water for visual flair. We come upon 2 Wraith tanks in such close proximity that you will see me actually board a vehicle for the first and only time in the campaign. Along the higher floor platforms, brutes fight and exit some kind of back armory, where the player can equip many weapons, but only for a short time. This points perhaps to the idea that Uprising and the Great Journey were really supposed to be one continuous level, as the beginning of the final level is an expansive set of vehicle encounters. It doesn't make sense to fight through all these enemies while leaving the 2 Wraith tanks intact. The use of enemies spawning on the player as they continue through the exit doors of this set piece on multiple occasions is so egregious. We've seen this before, but here it is used alarmingly. If a player is smart and can grab a hold of one of the ghosts charging through the final tunnel, it can trigger the ending cutscene while the enemies are still barreling through. It is an absurdity to have it reach the point where the player ends up fighting so many enemies at the end of these encounters. The biggest problem with this style of enemy spawning is that the level design is bottlenecked at the tail end, and we lose quite a bit of valuable fighting space.
The rings, Arbiter. The councils, are they
murdered by the brutes?
Vile, disloyal beasts. The prophets were fools to trust them.
Your pal. Where's he going?
To finish what we started. And this time, none of you will be left behind.
That structure in the center of the city, it's a Forerunner ship. And Truth is heading straight for it. If he leads the Covenant fleet to Earth, they won't stand a chance. You have to stop him.
That brute has the Index. And Miranda and Johnson. He can activate the ring.
If he does, I'll detonate in Emberclad's reactor just like we did the Autumns. The blast will destroy this city and the ring. Not a very original plan, but we know it'll work. No, I don't want to chance a remote detonation. I need to stay here.
High Charity is labeled as a C-tier mission, the next to last ranking, alongside Cortana, Sacred Icon, and Quarantine Zone, which really helps to cement the idea that flood levels in Halo 2, and one in Halo 3, are not held in high regard. I'll evaluate flood levels in general when I reach Cortana in Halo 3, so for now I will stick to our current engagement. High Charity is the only level where you play against the Flood as the Master Chief, and compared to the other levels with Flood, the player really feels that when they cannot go invisible to skip sections. Thanks to the flood growth now covering High Charity, as well as the darkness and fog that adds a degree of horror to the setting, we have, as a result, another tight, cloistered mission. High Charity is also shockingly short, and reuses assets from Gravemind, once again a 2-part level, only this time split up and interweaved with the Arbiters, like we mentioned before. For the Flood to arrive in such an important location feels momentous. It's just a shame that it plays out in such a strange and abbreviated way. This will be the last encounter with the Flood until a level called Floodgate in Halo 3. We do not have as much to talk about with High Charity specifically. Much of the mission occurs in transit through elevators, and while there are some infighting moments, the mission is so dark it's difficult to acknowledge some of the outcomes. So I suppose I can speak here about some narrative points about the Flood. Between these two levels, with the Flood on the Covenant homeworld and the Flood on Earth, in my opinion the biggest flub in Halo's story concerns them. Unlike Sarah Kerrigan in StarCraft, the Gravemind lacks any sort of charisma, and tying the Flood to some Overmind is a nice loophole that perhaps makes the lighting of the ring of Halo 3 okay, but it also presents problems with some ideas of the Flood from before, which was the idea that the presence of a single Flood spore means that the Flood will not be eradicated, and no cutscene exists in Halo 3 to attempt to clarify what lighting the ring did to the Flood. So while the stakes have been increased in High Charity in Halo 2 and Earth in Halo 3, it ultimately leads nowhere. With such a profound franchise like Halo, Bungie did not have much choice. If the Chief failed, and all life in the galaxy died out to the Flood in some biological form of entropy, it would have been a truly tragic end that would have caused a likely outcry by fans. But given the conditions of what we know about the Flood and the Covenant, what would success actually look like? The effectiveness of the Master Chief's story in Halo 2 is difficult to come to terms with. Largely, the player spends most of his or her time as Chief, chasing things down, either a Scarab or the Prophets. It is hard not to say the phrase wild goose chase when thinking of these levels. If the Prophet is stationed in one location, fair enough. Steps should have been made to arrive at that location. But if the Prophets are mobile, it seems incredibly silly trying to imagine the Prophets flying through this geometry under heavy guard, leaving behind a trail of fighting Covenant along the way. Neither option is either attained or logical, respectively, which means that when the Chief ends up back on Earth largely doing what he was doing before, the player cannot help but laugh and shrug their shoulders. This is what I mean when I say that the ending of Halo 2 is not the problem. I think, had the player been given a compelling campaign from the get-go, the prospect of a hedged ending would not seem so obvious. Even in Halo 1, the Master Chief tells Cortana as he takes off his helmet that he thinks they are just getting started, a suggestion that breeds excitement because of the greatness of what we just experienced. The same could have happened in Halo 2, only none of what the narrative provides in Halo 2 manages to land.
Get to Earth. Good luck.
After I'm through with truth.
Don't make a girl a promise.
If you know you can't keep it.
What is that place? Where the counselors were meant to watch the consecration of the icon. The start of the great journey.
There is still time to stop the key from turning.
I must get inside. Then mount up, Arbiter. I know a way to break those doors.
I suppose there is an element of coming full circle, from destroying a Scarab to protecting it, that adds a poignancy to the final level. Miranda Keyes is still captured among the Covenant, and now that the Arbiter knows about the dangers of the Halo rings being lit, he implores the elites to work with him to stop Tartarus. Why Tartarus goes to the control room to light the rings, and the Prophet of Truth goes to Earth, is not explained, and when you stop to think about it, does not make much sense. Though I suppose it wouldn't if you did not know the truth about the rings. Truth, oblivious, is likely going to Earth to commune with the Ark, a structure not discussed until Halo 3, and likely the reason the Prophet of Regret arrived on Earth to begin with. The Arbiter has not discussed what the Halo ring does to his fellow elites, yet they seem more than happy to go along with the plan to kill more brutes on their way. The first section is a vehicle one, which features some Covenant-centric vehicles. Like a fool, I jumped on a Spectre turret, which ended in disaster. From there, I took a more individualized approach. Working with hunters against the brutes is a great dynamic, where the brute shot, so effective against other enemies, bounces off. The room clearing section here is great for a player to shoot over the heads of the hunters into the next room at the floor above, a callback to verticality that, though not quite as complex as the Pillar of Autumn, is still pretty satisfying.
Listen,
and I sure as hell don't like you. But if we don't do something, Mr. Mohawk's gonna activate this ring. And we're all gonna die.
Tartarus has locked himself inside the control room.
Well, I just happen to have a... Come on, grab a Banshee and give me some cover. He's gonna know we're coming.
For a veteran player, the last two engagements can seem quite tedious. The player is expected to escort the Scarab, piloted by Sergeant Johnson somehow, as he uses the main gun to bust open the door to the control room. Of course, the Scarab is invincible, so the escort is not necessary. On higher difficulties, the dogfights with other Banshees, turrets, and ground targets can add up to a fairly difficult combination. So I, as the player, have elected to skip it. If the player manages to clear a path to the control room, he or she needs only to wait until the Scarab catches up, making all the fighting totally unnecessary. I have fast-forwarded this section for your convenience.
The icon in your hands. And do as you are told.
Please use caution. This reclaimer is delicate.
One more word, Oracle, and I'll rip your eye from its socket. Which is nothing compared to what I'll do to you.
Tartarus, stop.
Impossible.
Put down the icon.
Put it down and disobey the Hierarchs?
There are things about Halo even the Hierarchs do not understand.
Take care, Arbiter. What you say is heresy.
Is it? Oracle, what is Halo's purpose?
Collectively, the Seven...
Not another word!
Please. Don't shake the light bulb. If you want to keep your brain inside your head, I tell those boys to chill. Go ahead. Do your thing.
The sacred rings, what are they?
Weapons of last resort, built by the Forerunners to eliminate potential flood hosts, thereby rendering the parasite harmless.
And those who made the rings? What happened to the Forerunners?
After exhausting every other strategic option, my creators activated the rings. They and all additional sentient life in 3 radii of the Galactic Center died, as planned. Would you like to see the relevant data?
Tartarus, the prophets have betrayed us.
No, Arbiter! The great journey has begun, and the brutes, not the elite, shall be the prophet's escort.
The final set piece of Halo 2 is a boss fight, and once again it is a tedious and frustrating experience. In a terraced 3-floor arena, Tartarus has stubbornly continued with the launching of Halo in spite of hearing from the Arbiter and 343 Guilty Spark what the ring really does. His shield and gravity hammer are both big dangers to a player at close range, so you'll see me maintain my distance. Brutes and elites join the fight periodically, so as to provide both conflict and weapons in the event that the player runs low. Sergeant Johnson's sniper rifle, when shot 3 times, lowers the shield of Tartarus, giving the player the time to kill him. Until that moment, Tartarus is effectively invincible, which means that much of the fight is spent either waiting or evading. I cannot stress enough just what a failure boss fights are in the Halo series. Their emphasis on only a small portion of Halo's sandbox combat mechanics, as well as their strange caveats, make such moments a true low point in my eyes. A counter-argument may be that these boss fights make up for their weaknesses and narrative turning points. But as I have mentioned, neither Halo 2 and, as we'll see, Halo 3 can make a good enough story to justify their existence. Halo ODST and Halo Reach will drop boss fights entirely, to the great benefit of those campaigns. Once Tartarus is defeated, the final cutscene emerges, revealing the existence of something called the Ark, and wrapping up the events from Halo 2. We have spoken about the legacy of Halo 2 and concluded that it had a much farther reach with its multiplayer than with its campaign. The movement from local area network to online multiplayer through Xbox Live, and its map design of such wonderful levels like Lockdown and Zanzibar, and its deep community outreach, Halo 2 is a sort of breathtaking moment to look back on, given the rather sterile and corporate feel of gaming in large communities in our present time. Bungie managed to bring its idiosyncratic charm to a bigger audience, and did so in a way that made the anticipation for Halo 3 one of the biggest gaming moments in modern history. Halo 3 had a Super Bowl commercial, most likely the best trailer ever made, despite its brevity. Halo 2's legacy as a campaign is not nearly as straightforward. At the time, the historical context of first-person shooting campaigns was such that fans of the genre could look to perhaps Half-Life 2, or the nascent Far Cry, or to the polarizing Doom 3. The original Halo opened the floodgates for shooters on console, but few felt as good as Halo 2. It is wrong of me not to remark on this fact, and Halo 2 is up there with BioShock, Fear, and Call of Duty Modern Warfare as one in a line of great shooters that also featured campaigns. One might even go so far as to suggest that this was a golden age for premier shooter campaigns, which is why our current age feels so demoralizing. But Halo 2 also pushed Bungie in the direction of largely inside-out design, from the player on out towards the world, rather than from the outside in, emphasizing level design instead. Next time we'll take a look at the end of the trilogy with Halo 3, the game which wrapped up the Master Chief's story, for the time being. If you made it this far, thank you for watching, and I look forward to next time.
What's that?
A beacon.
What's it doing?
Communicating at superluminal speeds with the frequency of...
Communicating with what?
The other installations.
Show me.
Fail-safe protocol. In the event of unexpected shutdown, the entire system will move to standby status. All remaining platforms are now ready for remote activation.
Remote activation? From here?
Don't be ridiculous.
Listen, Tinkerbell, don't make me...
Then where? Where would someone go to activate the other rings?
Why the Ark, of course.
And where, Oracle, is that?
Got a new contact, unknown classification. It isn't one of ours. Take it out.
This is Spartan 117.
Can anyone hear me? Over.
Isolate that signal. Master Chief, you mind telling me what you're doing on that ship?
Sir, finishing this fight.
Silence fills the empty grave now that I have gone. But my mind is not at rest, for questions linger on. I will ask, and you will answer.
All right. Shoot.